At the time of his birth in 1530, the world of Ivan Vasiliyevich the Great Knez was a world better known to travelers from Italy, the Holy Romano-Germanic Empire, and the Balkans and the Middle East. Once the lands of the Roman Empire but now under Ottoman rule, but still somewhat foreign and mysterious to Western Europeans. Until the Mongol invasion of 1238 to 1242, the Orthodox Christian Slavo-Scandinavian princes in Russia maintained relations with the kings of Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Poland, Bagdan, Hungary and France, as well as with the Holy Roman-Germanic Emperor, and a series of inter-court marriages took place between them and these countries during the same period. The Mongol invasion profoundly affected the natural development process of medieval or Kievan Rus. However, there is no consensus among experts on the spheres of influence and the nature of this blow. When the Mongol invasion took place, only 38 years had passed since Constantinople fell to the Latin Crusaders in 1204. Moreover, this Latin invasion was a major blow for Orthodox Rus, who until 1296 had to follow the instructions of Nicaea in church governance because the ecclesiastical leadership had fallen into the hands of the schismatics. The Mongol invasion also destroyed what was left of Kievan Rus. A considerable part of the southern part of the Kievan Russian Empire fell directly under Mongol rule, including the untouched Kiev, and in the 14th century it was annexed to Lithuania by the Grand Principality of Lithuania, mostly by conquest. As a result, Kiev went one way, and the city of Vladimir on the banks of the Kyazima River, founded in 1108 by Knez Vladimir Monoma, went the other. The northeastern Nedoms, with the city of Vladimir as their center and the Novgorod state in the north, continued to live under the rule of their respective knights, subject to the Mongols. The structure of the northeastern Nedoms also influenced the new community around which it clustered. Compared to Kievan Rus, the climate was harsher, the winter longer and the forests denser, the winter days shorter, but the short summer longer. Communication with the Eastern Roman Empire or Central Europe was more difficult, and the history of settlement in the West was more recent. The independent city-state of Novgorod, which the Mongols loosely retained, was still part of the Mongol Empire, as it was commercially important to their masters. As a result of this division, the connection between the northeast and the southwest of the Russian lands was lost, and the old ruling and merchant classes' contacts with Eastern and Central Europe were greatly reduced, with the exception of city-states like Novgorod and Pskov. For these latter two cities maintained their trade relations with the Hanseatic League and the West through Smolensk, albeit drip by drip. Vladimir and Moscow could now participate more in commercial ventures in the Middle East. Henceforth, there would be no more marriages between European families of kings and princes and the Ruriks. There were some marriages with the ruling families of the Mongols, but after the conversion of the Golden Horde to Islam in 1380, the number of these marriages would be very limited. The Mongols did not settle in the Russian lands because they were not suitable for the nomadic life on which their huge cavalry army depended. Bata Khan established the capital at the palace on the lower Volga and sent Russian princes to the palace or to Karakorum, the Mongol capital in Mongolia, to renew their edicts of permission to rule, called Irliki. The long journey was so grueling that many princes, including such notables as Alexander Nevsky, died en route or on the way back. In the Mongol Empire, the person to be elected as Khan had to be one of Genghis Khan's heirs, that is, from the golden lineage. The Mongols were therefore more than ready to accept the principle that the Russians should limit the choice of their new Knez to the ruling family, the Ruriks, descendants of the semi-mythical Scandinavian Prince Rurik, and they often accepted the Russian choice. But when they themselves preferred another candidate, they rejected it without hesitation. One of the policies set by the Mongols was not to allow any of the principalities to become overpowered. The degree of physical damage caused by the Mongol invasion, the Mongol influence on the social and political development of Russia, and the extent to which the Mongols were responsible for the apparent backwardness of 16th-century Russia are highly debated among historians. Many factors must be taken into account to understand this issue. The suddenness of the attack, the destruction of the economy, the depopulation through enslavement and deaths, the loss of skilled labor through the conscription of young people and artisans, the looting of cities, the burning and plundering of fields, the whirlwind speed with which it all happened, and it happened again and again every time the Mongols decided to remind the Russians who the master was. The princes, who had suffered relatively little from the invasion because they were better protected, had to learn to submit to the demands of their masters, however humiliating, to deceive, intrigue, lie, and bribe in order to survive. However, from the second half of the 14th century onwards, Mongol domination over Russia was affected by conflicts within the Golden Horde. The victory of Dmitry Donskoy, Grand Knave of Vladimir and Knave of Moscow, supported by other princes, over a Mongol army on the Kulikovo Plain in 1380 increased Moscow's prestige among the Russian knights, despite the fact that the Mongols, who rallied after this defeat in 1382, raised Moscow under the leadership of Toktamish. In the early 15th century, the Golden Horde state disintegrated into the Crimean Khanate, the Kazan Khanate, and the Grand Horde. The two sons of Ulig Mehmed Khan, Khan of the Golden Horde, became vassals of Grand Knez Vasily II and established the Kasimogalari Khanate on the banks of the Oka River under Russian protection. A final settlement was reached on the banks of the Ugra River in 1480 between the Mongol Grand Horde Khanate and its allies, the Crimean Khanate and what was left of Poland-Lithuania, and a Moscow army led by the Grand Knave of Moscow Ivan III and its Mongol allies, the Khanates of Kazan, Astrakhan, and Kasimogalari. In fact, there was no real battle, as both sides withdrew without the armies meeting. After that, however, Moscow did not treat any Mongol army as its master. It continued to collect tribute within the Russian territory and divided a small part of it among its Tatar allies as gifts. Ivan III increasingly maintained his claim to suzerainty, Samodurjavi, over the remaining independent Russian Knezzets, including those now part of the Grand Principality of Lithuania, at a conceptual level. There was no such thing as a ready and omnipresent Mongol presence everywhere in Russia. There was usually a limited Mongol presence of administrators, tax collectors, junior officers, and cavalry units. Nevertheless, in the 16th century, many Russian noble families traced their ancestry back to the sons of Mongol Khans or other Mongol descendants. The Khan's sons, descendants of Genghis Khan, were considered superior to other princes in Moscow and hierarchically ranked either above or just below the Rurik sons until the end of the reign in Russia. When the Mongols conquered Russia in the 13th century, they were pagans and apparently tolerated all other religions. The Russian Church was not persecuted under Mongol rule, but this was not enough to make Christians tolerant of Islam after the Mongol conversion to Islam in 1340. Inevitably, the Russian ecclesiastical establishment was initially composed almost entirely of Greek churchmen from the Eastern Roman Empire. Priests and monasteries played an important cultural role in Russia. They acted as scribes, clerks, copyists, and transcribers of manuscripts. They set up calligraphy rooms, icon and fresco painting workshops, provided education, medical care, and shelter for the poor, sick, and helpless. The church was represented at all the important stages of mortal life: birth, marriage, and, above all, death. Monasteries were places of pilgrimage. The church also played an important political role in Russia. It was the only pan-Russian institution left after the Mongol invasion split Kievan Rus in two. The Archbishop of Kiev and All Russia, as the diocese was called, was also the spiritual leader of the entire Orthodox population of the neighboring Grand Principality of Lithuania for quite some time. Although the diocese ceased to exist in Kiev in 1299 and moved first to Vladimir and then to Moscow, the Grand Principality of Lithuania was formed when the nucleus of the voivodstva, or provinces, of Troki and Vilna, under the leadership of a series of powerful rulers, gradually spread eastward and southward, conquering, annexing, and swallowing up the former Russian kingdoms. When the Rurik dynasty came to an end in 1307, Polotsk also fell into the arms of Lithuania. Kiev was captured by the Mongols in 1362 and Lithuania continued its downward march along the right bank of the Dniester until it reached the Black Sea coast under the reign of Grand Prince Vitovt, 1393 to 1430, and was finally stopped by the Mongols in 1399. To the east, Lithuania swallowed the central basin of the Dnieper, extending from Smolensk to Lutsk, the former Kievan Nezate. All this territory was now the property of the Gediminoviches, or the Rurik princes of Lithuania. The Ruriks had inherited some lands from their ancestors, which they protected and added new lands donated to them as ancestral heritage by the Lithuanian Grand Princes. The language of the people was Slavic. In the Grand Principality of Lithuania, the throne passed automatically from father to son, as in Russia. In fact, there was no reason why the Russian lands should not be united under Lithuanian leadership. However, it was in the 1380s that the treaty that sealed the fate of the entire region of Poland, Lithuania, and Russia took place. One of the clauses in the 1384 treaty was that the Lithuanian Grand Prince Jagiello should marry one of the daughters of the Grand Knave of Moscow, Dmitry Ivanovich Donskoy. The marriage did not take place. In 1384, Jagiello turned his face to the west and became a Catholic so that he could marry the Catholic Princess Jadwiga, heiress of Lithuanian Poland. The possibility of uniting Russia not around Moscow, but around Lithuania and the majority Orthodox lands of Lithuania and the former Russia was consequently destroyed. Lithuania's dynastic union with Poland through her marriage to Sophia made it impossible to unite with Russia. As long as Vitovt was alive, and he lived into his 80s, the peace between them was preserved, but after his death in 1430, the ongoing intrigues between the various branches of the royal dynasty in Lithuania on the one hand, and the civil war in Moscow, Russia on the other, led to many princes from both sides crossing over to the other side for religious or political reasons. Although initially only a loose dynastic union, Lithuania's union with Catholic Poland exacerbated religious differences within the Grand Principality, and this conflict became even more acute with the advent of the Reformation. The conflict between the Lithuanian Ruriks, the Gediminoviches, and the Muscovite Rurik princes ultimately provided constant fodder for years of squabbling over succession within the Rurik dynasty, and all sides looked to foreigners for help, such as the Knights of Livonia and, even more often, the Crimean Khanate, one of the heir states of the Mongol and Golden Horde. From time to time, the Lithuanian Grand Princes tried to obtain the approval of the Patriarch in Constantinople for the establishment of separate metropolitanates for Kiev and Lithuania, or Kiev and Little Russia, the name given to the southern borderlands. This would free their Orthodox subjects, the majority of whom were Russians, from Moscow's ecclesiastical control, but with only very short-lived success. Many powerful and influential Russian metropolitans also used their political weight and sometimes their spiritual authority to support the Grand Knights of Moscow, who were at court and who were seeking sovereignty over the remaining free Russian Knezzets. The Ottoman incursion into Anatolia and the Balkans pushed the remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire to seek allies in the West, seeking the unification of the Catholic and Orthodox churches, which had been at odds since 1054. Unification had already been discussed at the Council of Basel in 1433 and was resumed at Ferrara in 1439. The Patriarch of Constantinople appointed a Greek named Isidore as Metropolitan of all Russia, but this was not the preferred choice of the Russian bishops. Isidore showed his willingness to accept the union of the Eastern and Western churches. The council moved to Florence in 1439 to escape the plague, and the Treaty of Union with Rome was signed there in July of that year. The union was unpopular in Constantinople and in Russia, and it also benefited the Eastern Emperor, who sought military assistance against the Turks. Isidore returned to Moscow in 1441, but Grand Knez Vasily II eventually refused to recognize both the union and the new cardinal, and Isidore fled and returned to Rome via Lithuania. In Constantinople, the imperial and ecclesiastical administrations were in disarray, and in Moscow, Grand Knave Vasily II sought to secure the appointment of the previously elected Russian bishop and metropolitan. However, he was captured and blinded in the Russian Civil War with Vasily's cousin and was only converted in 1447. Finally, in December 1448, Isidore was appointed Metropolitan of Kiev and all Russia, with 4 Russian bishops and the powers exercised by the Grand Knave of Vladimir of Moscow, even the Patriarchate in Constantinople. The Russian Orthodox Church had now undermined the authority of Constantinople and had become independent, with very important consequences in the long run. The Russian rejection of the unification of the churches in 1439 to 41 deepened the cultural gap between the Greeks and the Latins. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 was another major catastrophe and had an impact on the relations between the Russian Orthodox Church and the Grand Knez. There was no longer a Christian empire ruling in Constantinople, and the relationship between the church and secular power could no longer be imagined as a symphonic relationship between two equal powers. And the Russian Church, now also autocephalous, was in a position to put its weight on the scales against the Church thanks to the Grand Knezate of Moscow, which was more powerful and wealthy than the rest of the Orthodox world. The Patriarchate continued to exist in Ottoman Constantinople, but it had no power. The only independent, sovereign Orthodox power that could fill the vacuum was Russia. The fall of Constantinople inevitably meant that the Grand Knez reputation throughout the Orthodox world would grow enormously. The Russian Orthodox Church, in turn, would express its authority as an autocephalous church with the Metropolitan of Moscow at its head by the Byzantine concept of translatio imperii. Behind the titles of Tsar and Sovereign, schismaterges, used from time to time by Ivan III, was the notion of translatio imperii, i.e. the transfer to Moscow of its role as the religious, if not political, capital of the Orthodox world. This was not a transfer that happened on its own after the fall of Constantinople. It took place as Russia's new status gradually emerged after it was freed from the remnants of Mongol domination. It could also be seen as God's punishment for Constantinople, which turned its face towards the Latin Church, and God's reward for Moscow, which rejected the unification of the churches. In the last decades of the 15th century, Moscow provided financial assistance to the Orthodox Church within the Ottoman Empire, albeit not on a regular basis. In 1471, Ivan III, together with his Tatar and Tverli allies, defeated the Novgorod forces and executed their leaders. He forced the city to pay a large tribute, accept Moscow's rule, and sever all previously direct relations, for example with Lithuania. In 1474, Ivan III attacked again. The defeated Novgorodians gave up their right to elect their own knight and accepted Ivan III's rule, lost their great bells used to convene the Vis, People's Assembly, and consequently submitted to mass confiscation of church lands and massive population repression. The Grand Knez had now acquired a large landholding, some of which he continued to distribute as pomstai, homesteaders, land granted for military service for the duration of his term of office. He seized the Tver Knezate by force in 1485. Tver was a major rival to Moscow in the early 14th century and continued to see itself as a great knighthood on a par with Moscow throughout the 15th century. With Ivan III's status as Grand Duke of Vladimir of Moscow, the way in which he assessed his own power over the remnants of the Golden Horde and other foreign powers, as well as his relations with the formerly independent Russian Knezates, was correspondingly redefined. After the fall of Constantinople and the Battle of Ugra, he was given the title of schismaterges, or sovereign. This title had previously been used by Boris Alexandrovich of Tver. Today, it is often translated as autocrat, which is closer to the Greek original, but does not accurately reflect the Russian usage of the word in the 16th century, for the sovereign is independent, with no controlling authority. Although Ivan III's power structure in domestic affairs did not change, he tended to use his power arbitrarily, showing signs of increasing authoritarianism. This growing authoritarianism was also supported by the Russian Church. For a time, the Church continued the political aims of the Moscow Knezate and hoped to increase its power by adopting the example of Eastern Rome. Due to the gradual strengthening of the administration in the process of the gradual annexation of the Russian lands, the Grand Duke of Moscow significantly expanded his court staff. Since important decisions now concern the whole country, the increasingly powerful Grand Knez had to redefine the relations between the elite at court who agreed and disagreed with his actions. This court was an important source of social power at the time and the basis of the Moscow king's rule. Courts had existed before, and some up-punnage principalities had their own boyars. However, now the military and administrative personnel necessary to run the country were recruited from the court of the Grand Knez. In this period, 15th and 16th centuries, the problem was present in Russia, as in many European states, at a time when the power of the nobility was becoming increasingly centralized. Obstacles to the centralization of power included factors such as constitutional administrative structures in the Polish-Lithuanian Union, fragmentation in Germany, religious wars in France and the Netherlands, and dynastic conflicts and local rights in the Iberian Peninsula. One of the most striking features of Russian statecraft was institutionalization and centralization. One of the institutionalizing changes in Russian statecraft was the development of the tradition of the prince's consultation with the war council. The advisors at the court of the Grand Knez were usually boyars, princely families, and titled aristocrats. These people played an important role in the courtly authority and were often referred to as boyars. The highest court authority was considered to be the Council of the Grand Knez. The princely council was one of the institutions usually created by the boyars. This council was headed by the prince's advisors and assistants, and was consulted by many princes of the dynasty as it ruled throughout the reign of the Grand Knez. This marks the early stages of centralization and bureaucratic institutionalization in Russia. Ivan III reflected the maturation of his political thinking by making further changes to the Russian titular treasury. These changes were probably titles developed after his marriage to the niece of the last Eastern Roman Emperor Constantine Palaiologos. He began to use the titles "Tsar" frequently. This may reflect his intention to lay claim to the empire. Since there was no longer an Orthodox Tsar in Constantinople, he could claim ecclesiastical legitimacy and consider the imperial title to be almost hereditary, translatio imperii. He adopted the coat of arms of the two-headed eagle, probably in imitation of the Habsburgs. He added the words "of all Russia" to the beginning of his titles and extended the dynastic sovereignty to claim all the Russian principalities. It therefore also declared its right to reconquer the Kievan Rus principalities, now located in Lithuania. She even had enough power to force the Grand Prince of Lithuania to agree to this in a treaty in 1494. Although Sophia was the nephew of a dead Roman emperor, he could make the position of the Grand Knez of Moscow more attractive, make him stand out among his rivals, and consolidate his interstate position. The one called Sophia in Moscow was the daughter of Thomas, heir and brother of the last Eastern Roman Emperor Constantine Palaiologos. More Manuel had a wife and a son, Andrei, who died in Rome in 1460. Sophia seems to have avoided complete seclusion, given that Russian noblewomen generally tended to keep a low profile. At least she is known to have received foreign envoys. According to Herberstein, it was said that she was a shrewd woman and the prince often followed her advice. Sophia's arrival, and with it the settlement of large numbers of Greeks and Italians in Russia, led to a serious opening to the West in many areas. The political crisis of the last decade of Ivan III's reign is shrouded in mystery, further complicated by the fact that it coincided with the complete translation of the Bible into Church Slavonic and the first executions for religious heresy in Russia. To summarize, in 1497, when the Grand Knez lost his son by his first wife and crowned Prince Ivan, he appointed Dmitry Ivanovich, born to his daughter-in-law Elena, Princess of Hojand, as his successor and crowned him. 2 years later, however, two prominent boyars and former Lithuanian Gediminovich Prince Yuri Patrikayevich and his son Vasily were arrested at the court of the Grand Knez. The others arrested with them were executed. Vasily was forced to disguise himself as a monk and live under the name Vashin, while the Patrikeviches were kept as separate prisoners. The arrests seemed to take place in an atmosphere of tension between Vasily's supporters, who threatened Dmitry's throne, and the Grand Knez's efforts to preserve his authority. Moreover, Dmitry's mother, Princess Elena, had close ties with a group of followers of the so-called Mountain, who espoused incredible beliefs. The Judaization movement emerged out of a widespread belief that the world would end in 1492, the end of the 7th millennium according to the Orthodox calendar, triggering a religious and political upheaval. The loss of Constantinople, the last remnant of the Eastern Roman Empire, along with the expansion of the Ottoman Empire, exacerbated these upheavals as the Ottoman threat increased. Some began to use Slavic biblical words to express these fears, identifying the Ottomans with the Antichrist. But the fact that the end of the world did not come in 1492 did not allay these fears. The collapse of the Golden Horde, the Ottoman expansion into Europe, and the expansion of relations between Russia and Europe determined the foreign policy priorities of Ivan III during his reign. However, domestic policies were also important, such as the treaty with the Crimean Khan Mingli-Giri to secure the southern borders, relations with Poland-Lithuania, and the policy of seeking the Crimean Khan's help in the struggle between these states. Ivan III died in 1505, and his son Vasily, the victor of the struggle for the throne between 1502 and 1505, succeeded to the throne. On April 14, 1502, Ivan III transferred the Grandnezates of Vladimir and Moscow to Vasily as ruler, thus disinheriting the heir Dmitry, who had been arrested 3 days earlier along with his mother Elena. During the reign of Ivan III, dissent within the church and society began to emerge in a different and more influential form than before. In the late 15th century, the theoretical debates on land ownership turned into an intense attack on the Judaizers. A group led by Yosef Volotsky launched an attack against the Judaizers, who were accused of heresy. Many were arrested, tortured, and burned. Within the church, there were serious divisions between the possessors and the dispossessors. The possessors argued that the property owned by the monasteries should be used for the good of the poor, while the proprietors argued that the ownership of the land should rest with the religious leaders. These ideas were supported by Father Cyrilli Nil and his followers. The leading propertyist, Yasef Volotsky, advocated that priests should own land. Ivan III and Vasily III were thought to be willing to distribute land to increase their power in central Russia. Ivan III seized large amounts of land in Novgorod belonging to churches and individuals and distributed it to noble families in exchange for military service. However, the concept of Novgorod as a conquered territory and the secularization of the land was not yet fully developed. Vasily's accession to the throne seemed to be a period of open-mindedness. Vasily was proud to come from an imperial family. He probably spoke Greek, was educated and cultured by Russian standards. He was knowledgeable enough to converse with educated priests. During this period, there were notable figures such as Vasilij Patrikiev, who was sentenced by Ivan III in 1499 to live as a monk in St. Cyril's monastery. Vasily's reign was characterized by intense disagreement over property rights and land ownership. However, Vasily did not go so far as to declare the king's right to appoint princes as his heirs. He had to cooperate with the church on divorce because the church was considered strong enough to resist royal desires. However, this cooperation was complicated by Vasily's disagreement with the likes of Maxim the Greek and Vasilij Patrikiev, whom he accused of sedition and heresy in a court presided over by Metropolitan Daniel in 1525. Finally, towards the end of 1525, Vasily persuaded the Russian Church Council to grant him a divorce, and he began to look for ways to get rid of his wife Solomonia. Vasily was looking for an opportunity to incriminate his wife and forcibly sent her as a nun to a monastery called Sofia. His wife tried to get out of the situation by claiming to be pregnant, but was eventually sent to a convent. Elena Glinskaya failed to live up to Vasily's expectations. She had to wait 5 years to see the birth of Vasily's first son, Ivan. During this time, Elena devoted time to religious pilgrimages in search of divine intervention for the birth of her son. Along with Ivan's birth, various natural phenomena were also recorded. However, with Vasily's unexpected death on February 4, 1533, her attempt to make a compensatory arrangement for her heir by making a new will proved fruitless. Under Elena's rule, the administration of the central state loosened. In 1534, Prince Ivan Telepnev-Obolensky joined the council, and his affair with the Grand Princess caused rumors. Obolensky fought against potential threats such as Vasily's younger brothers, Yuri of Dmitrov and Andrei of Staritsa. Yuri was accused of trying to seize the throne and imprisoned. Subsequently, the other princes fled to Lithuania. His uncle Mikhail Lvovich Glinsky was accused of usurping the throne and imprisoned. Under Elena's rule, the nobles were treated ruthlessly. In addition to Glinsky, the nobles who were tortured included the service nobles loyal to him. Under Elena's rule, respect among the commoners declined and rude behavior towards the nobility increased. Elena's reign led to discontent among the people in general and anxiety among the nobility. After Obolensky's elimination, Ivan felt quite alone and vulnerable. His brother Yuri was too young to help and was deaf and dumb from birth, so he could not help him. Ivan's most senior and authoritative boyar, Prince Vasily Vasiliyevich Shusky, and his brother Ivan Vasiliyevich dominated the council and, leaving the young heir to his own devices, together with their close friends, seized their positions and fortunes. Vasily Shusky married Anastasia, the young daughter of the Tatar convert Tsarevich Peter, Elena's brother-in-law and his closest friend among his trusted friends. Not much is known about Ivan's education, but he was present with his mother at the reception of foreign ambassadors and even spoke Tatar with them. However, after her death, there was no one left to take over the prince's education. It is likely that Ivan spoke Tatar at court because there were many Tatars in the court and in his service. Ivan's childhood friends included the children of the Tatar Tsarevich Peter and the young Vladimir Andreevich from Staritsa. However, as an adolescent, Ivan seems to have spent more time hunting and tracking. Another activity Ivan enjoyed was throwing animals off high towers and watching them crush and disintegrate. It is possible that Ivan's execution practice of impaling his enemies was influenced by the Ottoman Empire through the legends of Wallachia and Vlad the Impaler. However, there is no evidence that this method was widely used by Russian rulers before or after. It is known that Ivan usually used this method in cases where he felt a sense of personal vengeance or for service nobles and boyars who fled to Lithuania. It is thought that epics, byline, and fairy tales, such as the legend of Dmitry Donskoy, may have played a role in the background of Ivan's childhood and adolescence. Metropolitan Macari may also have played a certain role in his education. Macari supported the leadership of Moscow and advocated communal church life. Ivan's coming of age necessitated a meeting of the Boyar Council, the Church Council, and the Grand Knez. On January 16, 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan was crowned in the Metropolitan Church, the Cathedral of Eternal Sleep. The ceremony was modeled on the Eastern Roman model. Ivan thought it was not enough to be crowned by a metropolitan, so he applied to the Patriarch of Constantinople for the title of Tsar. However, this process took a long time, and finally, in 1561, he obtained the approval of the Patriarch of Constantinople and strengthened his status. However, this approval stated that only the Patriarchs of Rome and Constantinople had such a right, and that a metropolitan had no authority to crown a Tsar. This approval may not have theoretically affected Ivan's authority much, but there is no doubt that it contributed to the rise of the Russian Tsar's spiritual power in the Orthodox world. It also helped that Macari, who had great influence over Ivan during this period, encouraged him to marry. In 1546, at a meeting of the United Council where Ivan's coronation was discussed, Ivan expressed his wish to marry. He said that at first he had not thought of marrying a member of a noble family, but since he had no family of his own in Russia, he would feel lonely if he could not settle down with a suitable Russian bride. Therefore, he decided to marry a Russian. Ivan's marriage ceremony took place on February 3, 1547, with a solemn religious service. In accordance with traditional Russian ceremonies, the celebrations lasted for 3 days, and the marriage ceremony was one of those special occasions when married women took an active part in court life. Ivan was now crowned and married, but he was only 17 years old, and the question of exercising his powers as Tsar and imposing his will on the boyars around him was an important one. How the young Ivan would use his power can be compared to the behavior of his near contemporary, the short-lived King Edward VI of England. It seems difficult to argue that Ivan was thinking of a reform program, or that he could direct the resolution of issues within the framework of his role. The main issue was the question of Ivan's young age and the extent to which he could act independently of the boyars' advice. The 17-year-old Ivan had a limited knowledge of the power of the ruling power and did not show enough respect for the authority of the boyars. Ivan had a strong intuition that he should be aware of his own power, as he had no adults around him to look up to. However, he faced many difficulties at a young age that prevented him from losing his self-confidence. On June 24th, Moscow was struck by a great fire. This disaster marked a period that would test Ivan's leadership abilities and show what kind of leader he would become. The fire disaster killed thousands of people and left many homeless. This disaster provided an opportunity to test Ivan's leadership skills and reveal his ability to manage a crisis. Ivan and his entourage took refuge in hunting lodges in the Vorobeevo Hills and endeavored to suppress the rebellion. These events were an important turning point, showing the challenges Ivan faced at a young age and how he would use his leadership skills. Ivan IV had already shown himself to be despotic and cruel in his human relations. Now he experienced fear and the anger that comes from feeling powerless in the face of a situation in which he suspected a hidden hand, possibly targeting him. This may have caused him to develop a paranoid personality. In Western Europe, as the state grew, individuals took on their own obligations, moving away from collective bail. In Russia, however, in the 16th century and even in the 17th century, mutual suretyship continued to play an important role. Promotion to positions at court was possible, but there was no concept of ennoblement, as the status of noble was not defined. Inheritance from father to son was a practice that weakened the aristocratic elite. It is true that at the beginning of Ivan's reign, the Boyar Council was the only body running state affairs. However, it must be admitted that this council was cumbersome and impractical. The appointment of new members and efforts to inject fresh blood into the council failed to make much progress in the system of determining the rights of noble families. Ivan's marriage was unpopular in princely circles. Previous great knights had usually married daughters of Russian princely families or foreign princely families. However, under the new system, it became possible for Ivan to choose his bride based solely on her appearance. In a society steeped in a deep sense of lineage and hierarchy of rank, it is inconceivable that influential people of the Gedaman and Rurik lineage would accept a young man who had not yet become a boyar and was a priest as their equal or superior. Moreover, the acceptance of the administrative authority of a metropolitan and the idea of state affairs being run by priests was alien to Russian orthodoxy. In his letter criticizing this situation, Ivan compared Sylvester to the Old Testament priest Eli. Eli had assumed the role of self-proclaimed king, and that was why Israel had been conquered by enemies. The assembly, known as the elected council, was the result of the class conflict between the boyars, who were committed to compromise with the service nobles in order to protect their lands, and the service nobles, who sought to acquire more land. During Ivan's reign, a number of important decisions were taken in domestic politics and foreign policy. However, the fundamental contradiction between progressive efforts to centralize the country and the preservation of the feudal structure remained. The Assembly of 1549 was an important assembly that brought together elected representatives of the popular classes with the Boyar Council, the Church Council, and court dignitaries. Such assemblies are considered the ancestors of the assemblies that emerged in European countries such as France, Spain, Germany, Sweden, and Poland-Lithuania. Russian historians, while emphasizing the similarities of the Zemsky Sobor with the English Parliament, point out that the structure of the 16th century English Parliament is misunderstood. The Moscow Knesset of Vladimir had absorbed many uppunages and princely estates, incorporated many important cities from 1497 onwards, and annexed territory from Lithuania. However, the categorization of lands was complex and confusing. There were lands belonging to the Tsar, confiscated lands, uppunages held by Rurik princes from time immemorial. Orthodox princes who migrated from Lithuania to Russia were also granted lands. The new code covered criminal law, civil law, slavery, and some aspects of property law, and was valid and binding throughout the country. For the first time, the rules for the dispensation and administration of justice were based on a legislatively enacted law. The authority of the monasteries began to decline in the 16th century. The increasing disputes over the monasteries' vast territories were a consequence of this. Some monasteries were seen to be in poverty, even though a third of their settlements were in the hands of the church. In 16th century Russia, the main issue was the rewarding of church lands for military service and the limitation of church lands. Maxim's letters to Ivan condemned the church's greed and unnecessary demands for lands. However, this opposition remained mostly behind the scenes. During Ivan's reign, the princes and boyars lost their independent identity and succeeded in forming a Russian army under the control of the Grand Knot. This took place through the subordination of military units, organized according to the hierarchy of rank, to the Grand Knight. The need to reward service rents with land greatly influenced politics in 16th century Russia. This need led to the desire of the Grand Kneses to seize the lands of churches and monasteries, and the lands of wealthy princes and boyars. Likewise, the pressure for land ownership increased among the service nobility. As a result, these service nobles politically separated from the influential landowners. During Ivan's reign, Russia was landlocked. To its southeast, the United Kingdom of Poland-Lithuania had vast territories. With no outlet to the Baltic, Russia was exposed to attacks from the Crimean Khanate. During this period, Russia had to deal with territorial disputes with Poland-Lithuania and attacks by the Tatar Khanates. Moreover, the strengthening of the Ottoman Empire created a new dimension in foreign policy. Ivan III, as Grand Knez, carefully managed foreign policy and took advantage of the internal conflicts of the Kazan Khanate. The Kazan Khanate was a conglomerate of various Tatar tribes, and Ivan tried to take advantage of this internal division to expand his territory. With the death of Ibrahim Khan, Ivan III had the opportunity to capture the city of Kazan in collaboration with Mehmed Emin. This was not a permanent conquest, but it reversed the process by which the Tatar Khans decided which cities the Russian princes would rule in, and made Ivan III a supreme lord invested in his succession to the Kazan Khanate. Thanks to the religious and political flexibility shown by the Russian Grand Kneses in their relations with the Tatars, Many Tatars kept their faith and lived in towns and entered the Russian service, or became Christians and married Russian women and entered the Russian service individually. Mehmed Emin lived in Kazan for many years in alliance with Russia, but died in 1518 without leaving an heir of the first rank. Vasily III tried to accept the 13-year-old Shah Ali from the Kasimogalari Khanate, but was deposed by a rival Khan. Shah Ali, who was deposed with the support of the Crimean Khan, was replaced by a Khan under the patronage of the Crimean Khan. During this period, the Crimean Khan attacked Moscow. Peace negotiations were held between Vasily III's governor of Moscow, Omvich Peter, and the Crimean Khan. Vasily III realized that in order to take Kazan, a fortress had to be built in Nizhny Novgorod, and founded the Vasilisursk fortress. This meant the first real territorial annexation of Kazan. However, the throne of Kazan remained in the hands of a Khan from the Crimean Khanate throughout the regency of the young Ivan III. The frequently changing alliances between Kazan, Crimea, and Poland-Lithuania resulted in Russian gains and losses. Especially important for Russia was that with the fall of Constantinople and the disappearance of the last remnants of the Eastern Roman Empire, Russia became the only free protectorate for the Orthodox Church. This led to the birth of the theory of a Third Rome of Moscow. The Islamic threat became even more pronounced, as most of the territory once under the rule of the Christian Eastern Roman Empire was now under the control of the Muslim Turks. From the perspective of the other Central European powers, Russia was no longer a diplomatic uncertainty but a force to be reckoned with. The crisis caused by the collapse of the Livonian Knights' Order intensified the rivalry over who would be their heir. Since Livonia was part of the Holy Romano-Germanic Empire, the Poles and Lithuanians were exposed to hostile attacks from the Habsburgs and faced hostility from the Grand Knights of Moscow. At the same time, Sweden was eager to protect the Finnish coast by seizing Livonian ports. Russia was not playing a decisive role at this stage, but Ivan III and Vasily III quietly maneuvered skillfully to expand their relations and increase their diplomatic importance. Under Ivan III and his predecessors, Russia specialized in interstate reconciliation with the Eastern Roman Empire and the Tatar principalities in the east. They had also gained experience in managing diplomatic relations with the powers in Western Europe. As Russia's diplomatic contacts expanded, Ivan III and Vasily III gained experience and diplomatic skills in managing these relations. In the process of establishing diplomatic traditions, Russia, influenced by Mongol influences as well as relations with the West, had to adapt for many years. In 1549, the Khan of Kazan, a descendant of Genghis Khan, died, leaving a 2-year-old baby as heir. For Ivan IV, this was an excellent opportunity not to be missed. However, Ivan IV's first campaign against Kazan was unsuccessful because his troops were unable to cross the Volga River due to its early thawing. Ivan IV participated in this expedition in 1549 and was deeply demoralized by the failure. The second expedition in 1550 was similarly fruitless. It was then decided to follow Vasily III's example and build a fortress on the Zeus, which would command the river. Part of the non-Tatar population of Kazan emigrated to Moscow, and Ivan IV promised to favor them, rewarding them with furs, horses, and money. The Kazan garrison numbered only 20,000 people, and the infant Khan's mother, Suyembyuk, was not influential in the administration. The people of Kazan decided to accept Shah Ali as their czar, but disagreements arose in the peace negotiations. Suyembyuk and her son were sent to Moscow, and part of Kazan passed to Russia. Ivan IV launched his fourth campaign against Kazan on June 16, 1522. The battle was fierce, and both sides suffered heavy losses. In the end, the Kazan Principality was destroyed and the city was sacked by the victorious Russians. After the fall of Kazan, the leaders of the various tribes that made up the population of the Khanate started a rebellion, which continued for several years. These disorders required the constant presence of Russian troops and caused heavy losses on both sides. With the fall of Kazan, the situation of the Tatars settled in Russia inevitably changed and their numbers increased. Tatar princes, whether converted or not, now began to play a role in Russia and occupied important positions in the armed forces. In March 1553, one day after the Christianization of Simon, a Tatar Khan from Kazan, Ivan IV, for some unknown reason, caught a fever and became seriously ill. Ivan IV's only son Dmitry was only 6 months old and had to be named heir to the throne. However, due to Ivan IV's illness, a regency was inevitable. Ivan IV's brother Yuri was also incapacitated, so the power would be concentrated in the hands of the Yuriev Zaharians, relatives of the Tsarina. Different opinions emerged in the court as to who would be the heir to the throne. One group argued that Ivan IV's son Dmitry had the absolute right, while others supported Staritsa Vladimir, Ivan IV's cousin. Since Ivan IV's illness was a serious problem, there were fissures between the different factions at court. However, Ivan Mihailovich Viskovati, a close deacon of Ivan IV, pressured Ivan IV to make his will. Some boyars resisted, expressing their reluctance to swear allegiance to the infant Dmitry. Ivan IV was aware that in the event of his death, Zaharian did not have enough authority and support to ensure the safety of his wife Anastasia and his child. He therefore advised the loyal boyars who had sworn allegiance to his son on the first day to flee to a foreign land, taking the infant prince with them, and go wherever God would send them for their safety. Following this incident, the heretics were subjected to a thorough investigation by a church council. However, it found it difficult to condemn the heretics because of the lenient approach of the church's abbot Artemi. For his failure to condemn the heretics, Artemi was tried and exiled to Solovki Monastery. In the meantime, others accused of heresy were also punished or exiled. Ivan IV's illness and the insecurity around him caused fissures between different factions in the court. This clearly showed that the power of the Zaharians was waning. It was also questioned what the real goal of the heresy investigation and the campaign to destroy icons was. However, Ivan IV's learning of the planned coup in 1553 increased his distrust of the princes and boyars around him. Ivan IV forced the boyars and princes to give up their right to own land without the obligation to serve. From now on, landowners were obliged to serve, and their private land could be confiscated on the grounds of insufficient service. This made it easy for the Russian aristocracy to exploit the weakness of their position. The late 1550s was a crucial period for Ivan IV's personal development, as there was a sharp difference of opinion at court over the direction of Russia's next campaign of conquest. The conquest of Kazan gave Russia a great advantage for eastern trade, and was immediately followed by the conquest and annexation of Astrakhan on the Caspian Sea. The Russians abandoned the old Tatar city and built a strongly defended fortress downriver, and a monastery was established to cater to the needs of the Russian settlers. Russia's trade with the West suffered severely as it passed through enemy territory. Russia's growing need for war threatened freedom of trade and weakened the positions of the Russian aristocracy. During this period, merchants like Schlitt made plans to supply Russia with arms and ammunition, while Ivan IV began to establish direct relations with Western Europe. During Ivan IV's reign, Russia's relations with Western trade unexpectedly strengthened. The arrival of the English captain Richard Chancellor to the shores of the White Sea and Russia's attempts to establish direct relations with Europe significantly affected the trade and political dynamics of the period. Like Chancellor, Christopher Columbus also went in search of a destination and unexpectedly found a different one, this time in Russia. But Chancellor's voyage was primarily commercial, as it was financed by the British Company of Traveling Merchants, and Chancellor made the most of the opportunity. When Chancellor returned home, the letters he carried were addressed to Queen Mary I, even though they were originally addressed to Edward VI. Chancellor's sight of land in the White Sea meant that direct trade routes with the West could be opened. Russia's far-reaching goals included uninterrupted transportation from the Baltic ports to the West. However, Russia's trade with the West was hampered by disputes between Livonia and Russia. The Chancellor's return was greeted with great joy in England, as was the permission granted by the Russian Tsar to open the trade route in a way that was very favorable to British merchants. Events in Livonia were developing in parallel with Russia's military operations in Kazan. However, Ivan could not risk advancing towards Livonia unless he had established a solid relationship with the Grand Prince of Lithuania, the King of Lithuania, and the Crimean Khan. The almost complete conquest of Kazan and the redirection of Russian troops to the Livonian border increased Russia's interest and influence in the West. In 1555–56, an attack was organized in the south against the Crimean Khan, who did not recognize Ivan IV's sovereignty over Kazan. The attack was led by Prince Dmitry Vishnevetsky, a Lithuanian Orthodox prince of the Lithuanian Orthodox, who was based in Ukraine, around Kiev and down the Dnieper River, and who offered cooperation with the Russians. It is not clear whether this initiative was taken by Ivan as part of an overall strategic plan or as an independent action. Vishnevetsky battered the Crimean Khanate with several successful attacks and occupied Khortytsa Island along the Dnieper River, which was to become the headquarters of the Zaporizhian Cossacks. This event led to a formal deterioration of relations between the Crimean Khanate and Russia. Ivan also successfully repelled an attack from Sweden. In 1554, King Gustavus of Sweden tried to form a coalition against Russia and announced his plan at the Diet of Wolmer in Livonia. However, in March 1557, a truce agreement was signed between the governor of Novgorod and the King of Sweden. According to this agreement, Sweden would support neither Livonia nor Poland-Lithuania in the event of a war with Russia. Relations with England were beginning to take shape. In 1556, the newly formed company of traveling merchants landed 3 shiploads of cargo at the port of St. Nicholas on the Ice Sea, which were transported down the river to Vologda and then overland to Yaroslavl and Moscow. The United Kingdom of Poland-Lithuania needed routes to the Baltic as much as, if not more than, Russia. This was due to the fact that their trade depended heavily on Europe. Poland-Lithuania, which traded with Russia, believed that gaining control of the Baltic ports and the Dwina River would mean breaking the pressure of the Teutonic Knights in East Prussia. Since the collapse of the Order of the Knights of Livonia, the Kingdom of Poland-Lithuania had been negotiating with the Archbishop of Riga over the future of the city and the choice of a successor who could transform the Diocese of Riga into a non-religious principality on the East Prussian model. In the meantime, however, in the desire to preserve Livonian independence, the Livonian cities turned towards Poland-Lithuania, but Riga was still struggling to maintain its independence. In September 1557, Poland-Lithuania and the Livonian Knights formed an alliance against Russia and signed the Treaty of Pozval, which left the remnants of the Livonian Knights Order under Polish-Lithuanian protection. This treaty, however, was seen by Ivan IV as a casus belli, an act of war, and war was immediately declared against Livonia before Poland-Lithuania had a chance to intervene. The war began in January 1558. The Russian army, led by Tatar Tsareviks and nobles, invaded Livonia. As a result of this attack, the port of Narva surrendered to Russian forces. This led to a complete change of commercial conditions in the eastern Baltic, and the trade out of Livonian control was diverted to Dutch and North German ports. The Russian capture of Narva enabled the Russians to achieve their goal of direct trade with the West, which posed a serious threat to the other Baltic powers. King Gustavus of Sweden tried to address the situation by petitioning Queen Mary of England to ban sailing to the Russian port of St. Nicholas. Russia's revived thoughts of an alliance with Poland-Lithuania and other Catholic polities against Crimea, in fact against the Turks, was in fact the result of Russia's fear that Lithuania might turn against it. When the 5-year truce between the two countries expired, Russia was concerned that Lithuania's participation in the war in Livonia would open a front against it. This was also in line with the spirit of Metropolitan Macari, who favored a crusade against the Muslims. In the summer of 1559, fearing for the future of Livonia, the Grand Master of the Order of the Knights of Livonia and the remaining knights surrendered Livonia to Poland, ending its independence and signing a treaty with Poland-Lithuania. According to this agreement, the order would cooperate militarily with Poland-Lithuania, receive a share of the occupied territories in any campaigns, and the remaining members of the order would live under de facto Polish-Lithuanian protection. The Treaty of Vilna was signed on August 31, 1559. Following this agreement, the old Prussian Grand Master Prince Wilhelm von Fürstenberg was removed and replaced by Gotthard Kettler. Denmark immediately seized the island of Isle. To ensure their security on the Livonian front, the Lithuanians prepared an alliance with Crimea against Russia. However, this plan came to naught when Russia attacked Livonia to prevent Polish-Lithuanian intervention. Livonian troops led by Kettler defeated the Russian army near Dorpat. This defeat was due to the negligence of the Russian commanders. The Russians were successful in military operations on Livonian territory, but according to some Russian historians, the uncertainty over the timing and objectives of the war divided the Russian aristocracy. As a result, Russia moved away from internal reforms, and there was a split between the war faction and the peace faction. 1560 is usually remembered as the year when the so-called elected council fell from power and its main members were discredited by Ivan IV. This period marks a radical change in Ivan IV's character and a radical change in the state administration. Ivan IV began to gather new advisors around him in early 1560 when he decided to gather new advisors to pursue the projects he wanted to implement. On August 2, 1560, strong Russian forces under Prince M.E.A. Mstislavsky inflicted a major defeat on the Livonian army at the Battle of Erms and captured Felon, the important stronghold of the Order of Knights. Ivan IV continued his offensive against the partnership of Sylvester and Adashev until 1564, accusing them of meeting in secret, issuing orders, giving worldly advice instead of spiritual advice, and undermining the glory of the crown. Ivan IV accused them of distributing estates to their supporters, spending them improperly, acting in their personal interests and disregarding his authority. In 1563, one of Ivan IV's relatives was suspected of treason. 2 voivodes were arrested, and as the investigation progressed, it became clear that Alexei Adashev, Daniel, and other relatives were also arrested. Daniel Adashev and his son Tark were executed. Sylvester was older and more independent than Adashev, and when he saw where the wind was blowing, he immediately retired to the Belozero monastery and began to live as a hermit. In July 1560, several serious fires broke out in Moscow. Ivan IV worked with his cousin Vladimir of Staritsa to extinguish the fires, and at the same time moved his wife Anastasia out of the city to his country mansion in Kolomenskoye. However, on August 2nd, about 3,000 Crimeans attacked Moscow, but were repulsed. These events were too much for Tsarina Anastasia, who was already on her last legs, and she died on August 7, 1560, at the age of 29. Anastasia was already in poor health, and her body was worn out after a series of pregnancies. Anastasia's death created a deep storm in Ivan IV's soul and made him even more ruthless and vicious. It has been debated whether Ivan IV suffered a psychological breakdown during this period, or whether his paranoia and panic increased. To cope with these feelings, Ivan IV took drastic measures and used violence against those he perceived as enemies. With the death of Anastasia, Ivan IV's brothers would effectively maintain and even increase their power. Instead of taking the daughter of a Russian family, Ivan IV considered a marriage of convenience. This marriage was to be part of foreign policy, and Ivan IV ordered a search for suitable Swedish and Polish daughters. However, he first turned to Poland-Lithuania, focusing on the Russian forces beyond Dorpat. As war had just begun between Russia and Poland-Lithuania, negotiations continued with Lithuania, and on August 8 a Russian delegation moved to Vilna and offered peace. As a guarantee of this peace, it was proposed that Princess Catherine be given to Ivan IV. Ivan IV decided to marry Catherine, despite the fact that she was younger than him. Perhaps he thought it would be more appropriate to have a child with her. However, as a condition of marriage, he demanded that Catherine convert to the Orthodox faith and that the details of the peace treaty be finalized in Moscow. Ivan IV was looking not only for a wife, but also for an alliance. A marriage with one of Sigismund's sisters could strengthen Russia's diplomacy in Livonia and find support in Poland. It could also strengthen its relations with the Lithuanian nobility and create its own group of supporters. The death of King Gustavus Law of Sweden in September 1560 ended Ivan IV's hopes for a Swedish marriage. A third delegation was then sent to the Kabartay Khan Temryuk. Temryuk's son Salamik had already been sent to Moscow and attracted Ivan IV's attention. One of Temryuk's daughters was selected and taken by Russian envoys, baptized as Princess Kukuny and married to Ivan IV. This marriage laid the foundations of the Cherkassky family, which became a powerful family during the reign of Ivan IV, who adopted the Cherkassky surname and took the name Mihail. While the Tsar was busy with his private life, the war in Livonia began to expand. It was not only a conflict between Russia and the Knights of Livonia, but all the Baltic powers were involved. The Danish government, led by Frederick II, wanted the island of Isle. The maritime trading powers in the Baltic region were divided against Russia because of its various policies. They all wanted to control trade with Russia exclusively in their favor and to prevent the Tsar from importing military supplies through Narva, that is, through the Arctic Ocean on British ships. Meanwhile, Ferdinand I ruled in Germany and warned the Queen of England to seize ships trading through Narva. The 20-year truce between Sweden and Russia weakened the pressure on Russia. In March 1562, the truce between Russia and Sigismund Augustus ended, and Ivan IV, together with the Tatar princes, launched attacks on the Lithuanian border. These attacks brought the war to Lithuanian territory. Ivan IV himself participated in an operation but had to cut it short due to the attacks of the Crimean Tatars. In August 1562, Russian forces led by Prince Am Korbsky failed in a battle and were forced to give back to Lithuania the territories they had captured earlier. In September 1562, when the Tsar returned to Moscow, the Livonian fortress of Tavarist had been captured and fighting had begun. The Livonian general Radwil razed the town to the ground. During this period, Ivan kept a watchful eye on possible betrayals, but had difficulty keeping track of the military objectives of his intensified offensive against Poland-Lithuania. These attacks would culminate in the capture of the key city of Polotsk, once the city of the Rurikoviches, which controlled the western Dvina and the road to Riga. In November 1562, a large army of 280,000 men and 200 cannons mobilized under the Tsar's command. In addition to his cousin Vladimir of Staritsa, there were 2 baptized Tatar Tsareviks, Alexander and Simon, and 4 more Tatar Tsareviks. On January 31, 1563, Polotsk was besieged, and 3 weeks later the city surrendered. However, Ivan did not fulfill his promises to the inhabitants of Polotsk of freedom and security of property and life. He confiscated the assets of the rich and prominent, sent the bishop and many of the city's dignitaries to Moscow as prisoners. He ordered the closure of the Latin churches and demanded that the Jews convert to Christianity, otherwise they would be thrown into the Dvina River and drowned. This crushing victory forced Sigismund to negotiate a truce to stop the Russians advancing towards Vilna. The truce, which Ivan accepted, lasted until the fall of 1563. In thinking about Ivan's future, he felt that capable generals like Prince Andrei Mihailovich should play an important role. In addition to being an accomplished commander on the battlefield, the prince, despite his young age, was able to speak to Ivan with respect and without fear. He also seemed to share Ivan's interest in his religious and political ideas. Prince Andrei Mihailovich could read and write Russian and Slavic languages, and in his mature years he also learned Latin and Ancient Greek. He was on close terms with Maxim the Greek and other churchmen and was known as a devoted member of the Orthodox Church. His family was elevated to the rank of saints, one of the ancestors of the Moscow princes, and Korbsky was a descendant of Vladimir Monomakh. However, the unjust and cruel punishment of boyars, service nobles and commoners under Ivan's rule was viewed with growing indignation by some, such as Prince Andrei Mihailovich. Korbsky, one of Adashev's supporters, was one of those who observed Ivan's arbitrary and cruel behavior. Ivan denounced Korbsky as a traitor and accused him of plotting to assassinate him. Ivan considered punishing Korbsky with death, but later changed his mind and stated that he only planned to strip Korbsky of his pride, lands, and positions. However, Korbsky's flight enraged Ivan even more, and he considered him a traitor. Ivan blamed Korbsky's escape on his own sins and argued that he should be punished. On December 3, 1564, Ivan left for Kolomna to celebrate St. Nicholas Day. He was on his way to his palace in Kolominskoye with Tsarina Maria and her children. Before departing, however, he had ordered the Livonian nobleman Johann Taub and Eilhard Cruz to take many valuables from Moscow to churches and monasteries. Ivan issued this order, probably inspired by his natural skepticism, temptation, or cruel habits. In his edict, he claimed that conspiracies were being organized against him and that some people intended to make an attempt on his life and therefore called a meeting with him to transfer power to them. Then, in the presence of people of different hierarchical positions, Ivan renounced the Tsarist crown, the scepter, and his clothes. The aristocracy was caught off guard by Ivan's move and missed the opportunity to accept his renunciation of the crown. Moreover, since there was no tradition of a contractual relationship between ruler and ruled in Russia, there was an unusual reaction to such an act. The people of Moscow were dependent on the patronage of their religious leaders and the powerful, and it was unthinkable to go against their ruler. At this time, it was unthinkable for the people to go against the Tsar, a leader who led wars against Protestant and Catholic heresies. The Metropolitan decided to stay in Moscow to govern the city, which lacked centralized authority. He sought the Tsar's patronage and asked for help in punishing those who opposed the religious and secular factions. The Tsar accepted this request and sent Archbishop Pimen and the monastic abbot Levki to Alexandrovskaya Sloboda. The priests demanded that the boyars who had conspired against the Tsar be pardoned and the country be ruled as he wished. The Tsar eventually pardoned the boyars by letting them in. The Tsar began to make a clear distinction between the church and the boyars and refused to communicate directly with them. At the Metropolitan's request, the Tsar decided to return to his throne. On his way back to Alexandrovskaya Sloboda, he was accompanied by commanders, a corps of service nobles and civil servants. New courtiers and special guards were formed, and the Tsar began to implement his plans for Oprichnina. By killing the son and father-in-law of his rival, Prince Alexander Gorbaty-Shusky, the Tsar removed an obstacle on his way back to Moscow. Indeed, the dark period of fear in Ivan's psyche seems to be behind him, and he has turned his attention to other traitors. One of the most important tasks before Ivan was to define the borders of Oprichnina. This involved the administrative division of the country and the management of the armed forces, and came at a time when he needed to realize his foreign policy goals. Ivan planned to delimit Russian lands and settle new peoples on them. In 1565, regions such as Rostov, Belozero, and Vologda were seized and well-established families were expelled from their ancestral lands. In 1566, 8 other regions in central Russia were captured and thousands of people were taken to Oprichnina. The rest were purged in the depths of the Black Winter, and the dead were left unburied. It was a time when the rich were forced to beg and servants replaced nobles. The princes of Suzdal suffered the most, the majority of whom had achieved boyar status. Many of the Yaroslavsky, Rostovsky, and Starodubsky princes, who, although more numerous, seemed less important, were also expelled from their lands and exiled to Kazan, along with a number of low-status boyars and a significant number of service nobles. Ivan's idea to establish the Oprichniki probably came from Tsarina Maria Temryukovna. Some scholars believe that Ivan's main goal was to establish a steppe khanate. According to this view, Ivan was inspired by Tatar influence and moved away from the form of the Orthodox Church and the Byzantine model. Maria Temryukovna has a bad reputation in Russian folk tales. In some songs, Ivan is warned against taking a pagan wife, and Maria and her brother Mikhail Oprichnina are blamed for her introduction. The war in Crimea was one of Russia's biggest and most persistent problems, as Tatar troops could inflict devastating damage with sudden attacks from distant steppes. Russia was ambivalent about an alliance treaty with the King of Poland-Lithuania because Poland also used Tatar mercenaries. It was not until the annexation of Crimea in 1783 that Russia began to build a chain of fortified fortresses to form a line of defense on its southern border. If Ivan embarked on a serious campaign against Lithuania, with the growing support of the now more powerful Polish army, he would claim Livonia in addition to Crimea. Ivan's relations with Sweden were also important, as King Eric XIV of Sweden sought to establish trade relations with Russia and control over Reval. Eric wanted to seize both shores of the Gulf of Finland, replacing the Russian-controlled Narva. In the new Swedish King Eric's view, the most logical ally would be Russia, and he negotiated with Ivan to renew the truce agreement that had existed in 1561. In 1562, however, an event occurred that complicated relations between Sweden and Russia. The conflicts between Sweden and Denmark in the Baltic, known as the 7 Years' War, became increasingly complicated around Livonia. Ivan may have been content to watch Sweden and Denmark fight, but he did not want to drive a wedge between himself and Denmark. For in 1562, he had approved Denmark's annexation of Sonneberg Castle in Livonia and the king's recognition of his brother Duke Magnus as Bishop of Isle and Duke of Courland. King Eric of Sweden sought Ivan's support in his war with Denmark, as he needed Russia's goodwill. The two leaders signed the Treaty of Orpat in May 1564. According to this treaty, Russia recognized Sweden's sovereignty over Reval and some fortresses, while Sweden recognized the rest of Livonia as Ivan's ancestral property. However, this agreement did not bring a permanent solution. In the same period, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, Zygmunt, secured an agreement for Crimea to stop its aggression against Russia, with Lithuania making peace with Crimea between 1564 and 1566. In 1566, however, The Crimean Khanate and Lithuania were asked to end their cooperation against Russia and join the war in Hungary. From 1563 to 1564, negotiations for a peace treaty continued between Russia and a large embassy delegation from Poland-Lithuania. Both sides made excessive demands and proposals that were rejected by the other side. Ivan demanded the return of the entire territory of Western Russia and the cession of Livonia. The Poles, on the other hand, seemed willing to conduct negotiations on the basis of uti possidetis, leaving Polotsk to Ivan. However, neither side was willing to make concessions. The Poles agreed to cede part of Polotsk but insisted on retaining the entire line along the Dwina and Riga rivers and refused to recognize Ivan as Tsar. In 1564 and 1565, the changing military situation in the Baltic and the failure to agree on the terms of the armistice between Russia and Poland led to the continuation of the war, which left both sides short of manpower and financial resources. Ivan planned to reorganize the Order of the Knights of Livonia into a vassal province, but this plan was frustrated by the rejection of Fürstenberg, who was loyal to his Germanic patron, the Holy Roman-Germanic Emperor. The spring and summer of 1564 were full of failures for the Russian army in Livonia, most notably the Russian defeat at the Battle of Ula in August. In the spring of 1565, a 7-year armistice agreement was signed between Russia and Sweden. During the same period, the Lithuanians continued to harass Russian forces, trying to protect their southern borders through an alliance with the Crimean Tatars. In 1566, the Lithuanians were forced to fight Sweden in Livonia. This situation, which required military support from Poland, was discussed in Vilna, along with possible changes in dynastic structures. On June 17th, a meeting of the Russian Boyar Council heard the report of the boyars who had been entrusted with the task of conducting negotiations with Lithuania. However, since neither side had renounced Riga, the council decided on a more limited ceasefire, abandoning hope for a peace treaty. A proposal for Ivan and Augustus Sigismund to meet in person was initially welcomed by Ivan, but no agreement was reached on matters of protocol. Ivan now wanted not only Darpad and Narva, but also the island of Isle, still occupied by Denmark. By June 25th, however, no agreement had yet been reached on the terms of the armistice, and negotiations on the Russian side, led by VM Yuriev, were postponed for 10 days. Russia could continue to fight to take and hold the towns and fortresses it wanted, or the Poles could threaten Polotsk by building fortresses on its side of the river and force it to give up its claims to Riga. This could also jeopardize the position of Darpat and Pskov. Metropolitan Afanasy did not attend the church council meeting in Zemsky Sobor. He was opposed to the Oprichnina and made his opinion clear to the Tsar's face. Finally, without waiting for the Tsar's permission, he gave up the white robe on May 19, 1566. Therefore, the large number of abbots and churchmen in Moscow can be explained by the necessity of a church council meeting to elect a new metropolitan. However, this was not to be an easy task. Before becoming metropolitan, Afanasy had been Ivan's confessor. He tried several times to use the church's traditional power of intercession on behalf of the many people Ivan was trying to destroy. The Oprichnina leaders were also critical of the appointment of a metropolitan, and after the second session of the church Sobor, the Tsar and the priests unexpectedly appointed Philip Kolashev, abbot of the Solovki Monastery on the Arctic Ocean, presumably to please the insistent hierarchy. Before his appointment as metropolitan, Philip demanded at a church council meeting that Ivan abolish the Oprichnina. He stated that unless he did so, he would refuse to be appointed metropolitan. He also demanded the release of those who had been arrested and imprisoned after the recent protest. Ivan, losing his temper, insisted that Philip sit in his office like a normal metropolitan and that he should not interfere in anything to do with the Oprichnina. Ivan dreamed of living in peace in a monastery, away from the tensions that tugged at him. In 1567, the place that appealed to him was the monastery of Belozero. This monastery was far north and away from Lithuanian or Tatar attacks. It was also on the road to the port of St. Nicholas, where one could safely board an English ship. Ivan kept secret his desire to establish an offensive and defensive alliance between the two states. He also conveyed his request for asylum with great secrecy. However, there was nothing surprising in this proposal for an alliance, even though Elizabeth had not made any commitments. Ivan also asked England for shipwrights to build ships suitable for the high seas. Elizabeth expressed general goodwill towards Ivan, but refrained from making any binding promises and always denied claims that she was providing military hardware to Russia. Ivan said nothing to Jenkinson about Sigismund's letters to the Russian boyars or their supposed replies. He characterized Sigismund's involvement of English merchants as a provocation. Sigismund intended to create enmity between Ivan and Queen Elizabeth and to make her nobles believe that he had betrayed her. Sigismund did not insist much on military operations in the fall of 1567, as he was preoccupied with delicate internal negotiations for a constitutional union between Poland and Lithuania. The King of Poland concluded that a closer union with Poland was needed for the survival of Lithuania, despite the opposition of the country's elders. The political, military, and economic structures between the two parts of Poland and Lithuania were quite different. The title of prince was not established by legislation in Poland, and princes in Lithuania believed that their titles would survive under a new regime. However, the major dignitaries in Lithuania had more power than their counterparts in Poland. Lithuania's notables were generally Orthodox, but some, like Radziwiłł, were Calvinists. The Poles, on the other hand, were generally Catholic, with Lutheranism prevalent in some towns. Ownership of Livonia also had to be determined, whether it belonged to Lithuania or to both. The King of Poland used the waiting period in Radoshkovic to clarify and discuss many issues between the Poles and Lithuanians. The Grand Principality of Lithuania had to fight the Crimean Tatars in the south and Sweden in Livonia, as well as Russia. Sigismund facilitated unity for the Poles by renouncing his succession rights in the Grand Principality of Lithuania. This meant that succession became elective, as in Poland. He also handed over the former Kiev lands held by Lithuania to the King of Poland, so Lithuania largely lost half of its territory. Lithuania's need for resources and military aid and Poland's willingness to provide them brought the two sides together, despite the objections of Lithuanian notables. It was also thought that Sigismund was waiting for events in Russia and hoped for a revolt against Ivan led by the Russian boyars. However, he never received a reply to the letters he sent in the summer of 1567, and the answers dictated by Ivan were negative. In the meantime, Ivan arrived on the western border with an army commanded by Prince Ivan Mikhail Cherkassky and Prince Afanasy Vyazemsky, and on November 12 he held an important meeting of the military council in his camp at Ryazansk. At the council, the Tsar proposed canceling the campaign because the heavy artillery needed for the siege had been left behind. The council supported him, and the Tsar and the royal family returned to Moscow. It has been speculated that Ivan may have canceled the campaign in the fall of 1567 for military reasons, or perhaps because he had received intelligence that the Zemstvo nobles were preparing a plot to depose his sister Vladimir of Staritsa. After all, Ivan had spent several weeks of the summer obsessing over this issue in order to counter Sigismund's attempts to seduce his boyars. Someone who was constantly subjected to accusations might have been filled with fear and treachery, convinced that he was surrounded by traitors. In the fall of 1567, Sigismund's decision to cut short the movement against Russia may have caused the boyars to abandon their plans. In this case, the conspiracy may have been uncovered. The boyars, like the Prince of Staritsa and Duke Magnus of Denmark, who had fallen into the trap of Ivan's plans for Livonia, feared mutual betrayal and reported the names of the conspirators to the Tsar. When Ivan, without arrest or trial, attacked Fedorov's servants in the fall of 1567 and began confiscating their lands, it was clear that Fedorov was seen as an enemy. While the persecutions of Fedorov and his people continued throughout 1567 and early 1568, in the background there was growing tension between the Tsar and Metropolitan Philip. Although he had vowed not to interfere in their affairs, Philip had opposed the Oprichnina's barbarities from day one and had initially tried to persuade Ivan in a private meeting by threatening him with Judgment Day. However, probably at a church council meeting in late 1567 or early 1568, he tried to rally support for the abolition of the Oprichnina. Philip failed to gain the support of the hierarchy and was denounced to Ivan by a member of the church council, probably Archbishop Pimen of Novgorod. Although Ivan was determined to put him on trial, many, even some within the Oprichnina, were of the opinion that the trial of a metropolitan was beyond the competence of a secular court. When several members of a Novgorod family like the Kalashevs were executed, some of the persecutions that had swept Moscow reached Philip, Ivan continued his ruthlessness towards the Metropolitan, while Vladimir of Staritsa supported the Metropolitan by giving him land. Arrests were completely arbitrary. Families were arrested regardless of status and executed without trial, sometimes directly by Ivan himself. And taking a knife in his hand, he repeatedly stabbed Ivan Fedorov in the heart, and all the soldiers present plunged their daggers into him, so that his stomach and entrails were scattered on the ground in front of the tyrant's eyes. Fedorov's corpse was then dragged through the entire Kremlin and the city of Moscow by his heels and paraded in the square. Meanwhile, all his servants, retinue, and slaves were strangled. In the continuation of the Oprichniki raids on Fedorov's estates, led by Ivan himself, oxen, cows, and even horses were slaughtered, as were the wives and children of the slaughtered men. Peasants' wives were even stripped naked and driven, like animals, into the forests, where they were torn to pieces. Ivan convened a meeting of the ecclesiastical council to try Philip on the basis of the rather meager evidence gathered by his private investigators in Solovki. The ecclesiastical council met on November 4, 1567, with the participation of several boyars, while Ivan was on campaign in Ryazansk, and declared that Philip had lived an immoral and improper life and ordered him to be deposed. In fact, Philip did not wait for the decision. He took off his official clothes, handed over his white robe, and prepared to leave, but Ivan, aware of Philip's ability to persuade his entourage, forced him to remain in Moscow for the time being. Philip was again leading the service in front of a large crowd when Alexei Basmanov and Malyuta Skuratov, with a large number of Oprichniki behind them, stormed the church and read Ivan's ukase that Philip had been deprived of everything, and then Philip's clothes were torn off him. He was put on a sled and taken to the Otrok monastery in Tver, where he was imprisoned under very bad conditions. At least he was not sentenced to trial, which was also possible. A week later, Cyril, the abbot of the Trinity Monastery, was appointed metropolitan. The metropolitan was deposed from the priesthood, and his church and lay servants were mercilessly exterminated by the Oprichniki. Eric's overthrow was followed in Sweden by a well-organized propaganda campaign against his reputation as a man and a king. The fact that such gross disrespect was shown to Eric, who in Ivan's eyes was in any case immune from wrongdoing as a crowned king, regardless of his origins, must have heightened Ivan's vigilance against the idea that his own nobles might conspire against him in favor of his cousin Vladimir, as well as fueled his distrust of the people. If these events could happen in Sweden, they could happen in Russia, and so he would need the assurance of asylum from Elizabeth of England more than ever. He protected himself by adding more land to the Oprichnina, especially around his refuge in Vologda, which became his main base. He also placed the Russian company's activities in the buildings allocated to it under Oprichnina protection. However, Elizabeth refused to seriously consider his request for asylum. In the meantime, Ivan was aware that the deposition of King Eric of Sweden in favor of a prince married to the sister of the King of Poland and the impending union between Poland and Lithuania had disrupted his Livonian policy. He was not strong enough to stand alone against Poland-Lithuania and had lost his Swedish ally. It was at this time that the new Ottoman Sultan Selim, who had come to power in 1566, asked the Crimean Khan to join him in a military campaign against Ivan. The Ottomans had for some time been reacting to the growing Russian power in the southeast and its control of the Middle Volga, jeopardizing the pilgrimage route from the east to Mecca and Medina. Russia's encroachment into the lower Volga also upset the balance between the Ottomans and the Persians. The Crimean Khan could have become a valuable ally for the Ottomans by claiming the Golden Horde's legacy in the Caspian Sea and reclaiming the Tatar Khanates of Kazan and Astrakhan. The Russians abandoned the old Tatar city of Astrakhan on the right bank of the Volga and built a new and stronger fortress on an island some 16 kilometers downstream. The Ottoman outpost was the Azov fortress at the mouth of the Don River, which flows into the Sea of Azov, one of the centers of the Turkish slave trade. By the mid-16th century, the Cossacks, under the leadership of Prince D. Vishnevetsky, who was occasionally allied with Ivan IV, had established themselves in the lower Don Basin and threatened Turkish trade. Relations with Russia, on the other hand, were not important enough for the Ottoman court to warrant direct negotiations, which were often, but not always, conducted through the Crimean Khans. In the meantime, the Kazan, Astrakhan and Kabardey migrants in Turkish territory, supported by the Crimean Khan and other local leaders, pressured the Sultan to expel the Russians from their lands. The idea of opening a canal between the Don and the Volga began to be discussed. Accordingly, the Turks would have the opportunity to march from Azov up along the Don to Perevalokha and then cross the Volga into central Russia or down to Astrakhan. It could also become a base for campaigns against Persia or into the Caucasus. Selim was more favorable to this plan than Suleiman, and the possibilities began to be seriously explored. In early 1568, the Ottomans decided to organize an operation. Ships were being built in Kiev, artillery and janissaries were being assembled in Constantinople, along with an army of 15,000 men from the Balkan provinces. Military equipment and ammunition, as well as the manpower to dig the canal, were gathered in Crimea. The Crimean Khan Devlet-Giri was less than enthusiastic about the prospect of his policies being more closely controlled by the Turks. The Russians were kept fully informed of the Turks' plans through their envoy in Crimea, Afanasy Nagy. Since it did not suit Crimean politics for the Ottomans to settle in Astrakhan and dominate the Caucasus and the Caspian Sea, they secretly informed the envoy about what the Ottoman court was planning. News that a canal would be dug spread across Europe, and the idea attracted a lot of attention. The Turkish fleet carrying troops sailed from Azov in July 1569 and sailed up the Don, arriving in August at Perevalokha, where the Ottomans were to start canal construction and join the Crimean army. But they were too late. The Don was too shallow and the crossing between the Don and the Volga too difficult, and the digging was beyond the capacity of those gathered there. This enraged the Turks. The project was cancelled, and the Turkish and Crimean armies retreated to besiege Astrakhan. They occupied the old, abandoned city. The local Tatars seemed happy to have served the army by providing river galleys. However, no progress was made against the new Russian fortress, which was defended by Prince Peter Serebryanovich Obolensky, who had a fleet of his own. The real reason for the failure was in fact the difference of opinion between the Turks and the Crimeans, for according to some accounts the Crimeans had thrown the Turkish plans into the bin by discouraging them from marching on Astrakhan again. The Turks and Crimeans finally lifted the siege in September 1569, as the Turks and Crimeans could not afford to stay long in a country whose winters were not at all suitable for accommodation. The Turks went off to fight the Venetians, and in April 1571 a peace treaty was concluded by correspondence between the Ottoman Empire and Ivan. Ivan was now thinking of settling the war in the north by treaty by establishing a Livonian vassal kingdom under Russian patronage. It is very possible that the proposal came from Johann Taub and Eilhard Cruz, two Livonian nobles in his service, and Ivan Viscovati, the head of the Foreign Office, who was never enthusiastic about the Livonian War. Magnus could easily have been considered the most suitable candidate for the new kingdom. In particular, he dominated the island of Ossel and the Danish presence in Livonia and was the younger brother of King Frederick II of Denmark. He had been looking for a settlement for himself and his wife for some time. The Russian embassy sent to take Catherine Jagiellonka also returned from Stockholm without a queen, but with detailed information about Eric's overthrow in June 1569. The next event in Ivan's immediate circle that may have had a disruptive effect on his emotional equilibrium was the death on September 9, 1569 of his Tsarina, Princess Maria Yaroslavovna of Kabardey, then probably in her 20s. In 1563, she gave birth to a son, but he died when she was only a few months old, and nothing is known about her relationship with Ivan. The death of Tsarina Maria seems to be shrouded in mystery. There are rumors that she was poisoned by the tribes or killed for attempting to poison her husband. Apparently, the people attributed to her the change in Ivan's temperament after Anastasia's death. In addition, as Oprechnik Heinrich von Staden points out, the same people also seem to have blamed the Tsarina for the creation of a special regiment of guards, the Oprichniki, for Ivan's personal security. A well-dressed, well-paid, highly paid regiment of guards that would stay with him day and night. There is no reason to think that Ivan was not deeply pained by the loss of Maria. Maria may have been the inventor of the outrageous feasts held at the palace, featuring jesters, dwarfs, and buffoons. Or, simply put, she may have kept Ivan in good spirits. If Ivan was very fond of his deceased wife, this event, like the death of Anastasia, may have completely destabilized him. This death, combined with what happened to King Eric of Sweden, may have deepened Ivan's lingering doubts about the loyalty of his cousin Vladimir of Staritsa. Maria's death also seriously undermined Ivan's position in the south, where unrest had begun among the various Cabarete princes. Polish-Lithuanian relations and the situation in the Livonian War were deteriorating. A closer alliance with Lehista was inevitable, although the Lithuanian leaders tried to postpone the coming of that fateful day. Lehista wanted Ivan as a loyal, reliable, and solid partner. Ivan, for his part, was able to reconcile his politics and his private life with peace of mind. Arrangements for the union were finalized in the summer of 1569. Overcoming many hurdles, the parties agreed that Livonia would be jointly owned and governed by Poland and Lithuania, and drafted a new constitutional framework for the United Kingdom of Poland-Lithuania, as it would later be called. Lithuania's constant change of heart about this union caused great anger, but first Podlasia, then Volhynia, and finally the Palatinate of Kiev were incorporated into the Kingdom of Poland, and Lithuania suddenly lost more than half of its territory to Poland. Poland now had a Ukrainian problem. Many difficulties were encountered in the implementation of this new administrative organization, but over time, Poland-Lithuania managed to find its own solutions. Ivan's foreign policy and military alliances were severely disrupted by the events of this period. Sweden under King Johann III became a hostile power in the region, while Lithuania, which had the right to call on the Polish army, which was much stronger than its own, to come to its aid in the event of an attack, became immeasurably stronger. On top of that, any attempt to secure the Lithuanian throne was tied to the elections, which were also a factor in determining the Catholic Polish crown, thus infinitely complicating the diplomatic room for maneuver. Culturally, the Novgorodians differed from the Muscovites in that they lived in a major center of commerce, arts, and crafts, maintained close contact with European trade. They spoke with a different accent and, above all, they still retained a primary loyalty to their traditional state structure, which had its own boyars and service nobles, and was headed by an archbishop in white robes. The churches and monasteries possessed enormous wealth, both in terms of wealth and land. The Novgorodians were not happy with Ivan's constant state of warfare, and especially with the fact that he had to see his troops off to fight in distant places like Kazan. They found it difficult to pay for the weapons and equipment they had to carry to the wars, and their economic situation was further worsened by the establishment of the Oprichnina. A considerable number of pomshchiks were purged to make room for the oprichniks, and resentment arose as a result. There had also been a decline in agricultural production, and the increased taxes had become even more difficult to pay due to the low harvest. A certain number of pomeshchiks who participated in the 1566 assembly were immediately discredited and purged or killed. Novgorod was transferred to the administration of the Zemshina and was therefore subjected to the violence of the Oprichniki, and some pomshchiks were even exterminated in the aftermath of the Fedorov affair. On top of all this, there were two serious outbreaks of plague in the 1560s. The execution of Vladimir of Staritsa and his family, who were popular in Novgorod and had a second residence there, probably added insult to injury. The Lithuanians did not hold the city for long, but the Russians who failed to hold it and were retaken by the real oprichniks who arrived later were all beheaded. The Russians whom the Lithuanians had taken as prisoners when they retreated from the city were executed after they were released and returned to their homeland in July. The Lithuanians who had been captured during the same campaign perished on charges of treason. This seems to have fed Ivan's concern that the seeds of treachery had been sown in the lands of Tver, Pskov, and Novgorod. In March 1569, Ivan targeted the inhabitants of these cities, forcibly expelling some 450 families from Pskov and 150 from Novgorod, mostly from the lower classes, into the interior of the country. Throughout 1567, 1568, and 1569, there was a continuous succession of executions in Moscow or wherever the Tsar was. There was no normal formal process of execution. From wherever the Tsar was, on horseback, in church, or in the royal chambers, he could order an execution on the spot. On January 2nd, 1570, Ivan marched on Novgorod and laid siege to the city so densely that not a single soul could escape. His first target was the church. The Oprichniki scattered the churches, monasteries, and nunneries and captured several hundred priests. For days later, when Ivan and his 1,500 or so oprichniks entered the city, they were forced to give up their property by public floggings and beatings, not pravage, especially on the shins in front of their calves. Ivan finally made his way to St. Sophia Cathedral. On the bridge over the Fokhov River, he was met by Archbishop Pimen, who had been Ivan's loyal supporter up to that point, carrying a cross and icons which he held above his head. Here Armageddon was beginning. Not only did the Tsar refuse to allow the archbishop to bless him, he loudly proclaimed in public that he was the archenemy of the government and the church. After the looting of the Novgorod churches, the oprichniks set their sights on nobles and rich merchants. They not only took away their property, but also looted their homes. Finally, they burned down the homes, shops, stables, and barns of the poorer townspeople. While all these cruel events were going on, Ivan was pursuing a cautious diplomacy to maintain stability in the north and building a solid defense line in the south. Meanwhile, the Crimean Khanate's renewed threats from the south had further strained the situation, and the borders had to be secured by shifting the armies to the south, and the Tsar himself had to be present. News from Lithuania indicated that King Zygmunt Augustus was showing signs of illness. There was uncertainty in the administration of the kingdom, and the throne was at risk of falling into a vacuum. This raised the possibility that Ivan might lay claim to the Polish throne. On June 10, 1570, the Polish-Lithuanian delegation appeared before Ivan and raised the issue openly for the first time. However, the deteriorating health of Zygmunt Augustus made the need for a truce urgent. The Lithuanians and Russians were closely related, and it was impossible for Ivan to prevent the two sides from speaking informally to each other, as there was no language barrier between them. Many Russians opposed the treaty with Lithuania because, in the absence of war, it would allow Ivan to keep his hands free and harm his own subjects. In the end, the Queen's offer was quite lenient. She would establish and maintain a close relationship with Ivan, in which they would act in unity, as friends and sisters, indefinitely. Despite England's pledge to act in concert with Russia, Ivan was still not sure that an alliance of promises would fully meet his needs. Elizabeth, on the other hand, did not want to be forced into a war anywhere and agreed to help Ivan. While Ivan was busy with the Polish-Lithuanian embassy convoy and correspondence with Elizabeth, on June 10, 1570, Magnus of Denmark arrived in Moscow with the approval of his brother, the King of Denmark, and was officially received as King of Livonia. Magnus swore allegiance to Ivan, was crowned as the vassal king of Livonia with the right of succession, and received the necessary approval from Ivan. Although Ivan had thus made an appointment with the right of succession, in fact he first of all had to bring the whole of Livonia under his control. There were many cities in Livonia, such as Riga, which at that time belonged to the territories captured by Russia, Poland, and Sweden. The new kingdom would enjoy preferential trade privileges within Russia. It would enjoy a great deal of autonomy, as Russian officials and tax collectors would be excluded from the territory, and Magnus would feel obliged to fulfill his promise to provide Ivan with military assistance, albeit on a modest scale, if he were to undertake a military campaign. The new kingdom would also ensure the free flow of Russian imports and exports to and from the West, which was Ivan's main objective. While Ivan was carrying out his terrible purge of the armed forces and the administrative structure, dark clouds were gathering over his foreign relations. Johann III, who ascended the throne in July 1569, shortly after the deposition of King Eric XIV of Sweden, sent an embassy headed by Paul J. Usson, Bishop of Abo, to negotiate a reconciliation between Sweden and Ivan immediately after his coronation. However, when Ivan returned to Moscow from his campaign to punish Novgorod in May 1570, he refused to receive the Swedish delegation. Moreover, he knew that his 3-year truce treaty with Poland-Lithuania was due to expire on June 20, 1570, which gave him greater comfort because he was not afraid that if he went to war with Sweden, Poland-Lithuania might attack Russia in support of Sweden. In May and June 1570, however, Ivan pursued an incomprehensible policy. The Tsar acted as if he was trying to create a rift with Sweden. On June 6, 1570, the Swedish diplomatic delegation summoned to the Kremlin, under threats of exile, torture, and imprisonment, agreed to continue negotiations in Novgorod in an attempt to appease Ivan. However, the Russian authorities insisted on the surrender of Catherine Jagiellonka as a precondition for any agreement. Over time, the war in Livonia became increasingly painful for Denmark, Sweden, and their third partner Lubeck, as Lubeck suffered from losing trade advantages to other Hanseatic League member cities. However, the possibility that Denmark would support King Magnus of Livonia, as Ivan had hoped, failed. King Frederick of Denmark was not interested in being a vassal of his younger brother Ivan. Behind the scenes, Emperor Maximilian II, the King of France, and Sigismund negotiated a peace treaty on November 30th, 1570 at the peace conference organized by Augustus in Stettin, ending the Northern Wars, known as the 7 Years' War. Meanwhile, the siege of the Swedish-controlled city of Reval, led by Russian troops under King Magnus, was weakening. Denmark flatly refused to help, and Ivan was unable to send more troops due to lack of funds. In late March 1571, Magnus finally gave up the fight for Reval and lifted the siege. He had now become useless to Ivan. No longer constrained by Ottoman policy, the Crimean Khan was free to embark on a new campaign against Russia. On May 23rd, the Crimean armies advanced with unexpected speed towards Moscow, deprived of its military forces. The Crimean Khan settled in Ivan's Kolomenskoye Palace on the outskirts of the city, while the Russian armies and the Oprichnina troops under Prince Vyacheslav Rostovsky scattered into the city. However, the city, vulnerable to the weapons used by the Crimeans, set fire to Moscow's leafs on May 24th, which, under the influence of a sudden gust of wind, engulfed wooden Moscow in flames. Ivan returned to Moscow on June 10, 1571, and received messengers sent by the Crimean Khan. The messengers addressed the Tsar with the utmost disrespect, threatening him, demanding the surrender of Kazan and Astrakhan and the payment of tribute as before. Ivan was forced to treat the messengers kindly and welcomed them in his old clothes. He ordered the head of the diplomatic delegation, Afanasy Nagoy, who had been in Crimea for a long time, to start negotiations with Devlet-Giri Khan. However, his offer to cede Astrakhan to the Crimean Khans, subject to Russian approval, was rejected. This incident fueled Ivan's anger against the Oprichnina generals, and 4 of them were executed in the summer of 1571. Sigismund Augustus was willing to maintain the truce with Russia and, at Ivan's request, sent envoys to negotiate a treaty in the spring of 1572. However, military problems were overshadowed by domestic issues. Meanwhile, Ivan was trying to prove that his marriage to Marfa Sobakina was invalid and that she had died a virgin, so that his 4th marriage would not be forbidden. Despite the divergent views in the Christian world, and with his children without a mother, Ivan was determined to have a 4th marriage. When the church was left without a head, Ivan persuaded the church council to grant permission for his 4th marriage to Anna Koltovskaya. The Crimean Khan, together with Crimean and Nogai forces, appeared on the banks of the Oka River on July 27, 1572. Russian troops were stationed in Serpukhov under the command of Mikhail Vorotinsky, and others came from both Zemshina and Oprichnina. After a pitched battle between the two sides, the Crimeans broke through the Russian defenses and advanced towards Moscow together with the Tatar army led by Devlet-Giri. However, the Russian army managed to stop the Tatars at a place called Melody. This attack was not a sudden raid, but a decisive offensive aimed at the conquest of the region and was supported by the Ottoman Empire. The general shortage of weapons and food after the plague epidemic, famine, and the fire of Moscow posed a serious threat to the already weak Russian army. The noble servant Timur Ada Ikin had captured Mirza Divy, a prominent Tatar commander. However, the Tatars responded with a counterattack and both sides suffered heavy losses. A successful maneuver by Vorotinsky allowed him to get behind the Tatars and, supported by the army of Ivan's protege Kovarostinin, he struck the Tatars from behind. The Tatars could not withstand this two-pronged attack, and the Khan's 2 sons and many high-ranking Tatar officers were killed. On August 6, 1572, in Novgorod, Ivan received news of the great victory of the Russian armies over the Crimean Tatars and their Turkish allies near Moscow. This victory was a joint achievement of the Oprichnina and Zemshina and was celebrated with great feasts. However, this victory also revealed the military weakness of the Oprichniks. It is not known exactly when and why Ivan decided to abolish the Oprichnina, but it is possible that he did so for different reasons. It could be that the Oprichnina was no longer useful, that Ivan did not see it as an instrument of unlimited power, or that he saw it as an unreliable structure. In the fall of 1572, when Ivan moved to put an end to the Swedish claims, his army did not consist of 2 separate armies led by separate commanders. All officers were united under a single command. Ivan drew criticism in October 1572 when he banned land grants to monasteries. The death of Sigismund Augustus on July 19, 1572, raised the question of who would succeed to the throne in Poland. This may have been one of the reasons why Ivan abolished the Oprichnina, as he had tried to conceal its existence in Poland. During his renewed campaign against Sweden, Ivan attacked the Swedish-controlled fortress of Pida in Livonia, led by King Magnus of Livonia and Mr. Bepulatovic, Khan of the Kasimogolari Khanate. This attack caught the Swedish and Estonian forces off guard and led to an unexpected Russian victory. After the death of Sigismund Augustus, both the Tsar and the Polish-Lithuanian notables were thinking about the problems that might arise. The Lithuanian notables still supported the Tsar's son Fedor, but some of them were worried that the Polish nobles might approach Ivan on their own. The various factions within Poland-Lithuania were divided depending on their religious and social background, and also differed on the future of the Ukrainian lands. These territories had been given to Lithuania by Sigismund Augustus, but they hoped to be taken back by the Lithuanians. This led to a process of secret diplomacy and maneuvering, as the terms of the unification of Lublin stipulated that the person who could be chosen for the Lithuanian throne had to be enthroned by the King of Poland. Ivan was initially cautious and favored the continuation of the negotiations for fear of a war for the thrones. However, the Lithuanian embassy delegation arrived in Novgorod with the promise that their safety would be ensured. For Lithuanian dignitaries, the prospect of a ruler like Ivan on the Lithuanian throne was terrifying. The Lithuanians thought that Russia should also cede territory to Lithuania, but in fact they wanted to avoid the union of the two thrones under a strong ruler and believed that they could avoid this danger by electing the inexperienced Fedor. There were intense debates about political unification. Ivan insisted on seeking a solution for the future of Poland and Lithuania. His proposal was that if Fedor left no heir, Poland and Lithuania would be left to his dynasty. This proposal contradicted one of the fundamental principles of the Polish-Lithuanian constitution, namely the right to choose their king. However, Ivan saw this proposal as an important step towards a lasting peace. According to Ivan, the territories would be divided, with Polotsk and Kurland going to Lithuania and Livonia, including Riga, to Moscow. He also stated that Russia and Lithuania would be united if Lithuania itself elected him as ruler. Ivan also stated that he thought it would be better for him as the elected prince of Poland-Lithuania. However, Ivan's proposal was not accepted by Lithuania, and as a result he lost his support within the same. In this situation, Henri, the French Duke of Anjou, was elected as King of Poland and Grand Prince of Lithuania. However, Henry's election was undesirable for Ivan and Emperor Maximilian II, as they were both skeptical of the relations between France and the Ottoman Empire. This led Ivan and Maximilian to act together, and Maximilian demanded that Henri ensure his passage through imperial territory on his way to Poland. Negotiations were held between the two powers over the division of Lithuania. However, Ivan did not recognize the King of Poland and had him deposed after he fled to France. In Henry's place, the throne remained vacant and a series of negotiations began to choose the new King of Poland. In the process, Ivan's demands and strategies significantly influenced the political landscape of Poland and Lithuania. Ivan felt a resistance to the boyars within his personal dvor, as he had before he established the Oprichnina. Moreover, in the mid-1570s, he seems to have taken an angry attitude towards the church hierarchy and religious organization. In October 1572, it is recalled, he issued a decree forbidding nobles to make any land donations to monasteries. The outbreak of war with Sweden prompted Ivan to consider the idea of a truce, and he sent his representative with a written message to Sweden. However, the Swedes were now hesitant to accept long letters from Ivan. According to a statement in the military register, Ivan IV appointed Grand Knez Simon Bepulatovic as the Grand Knez of Russia in the fall of 1575. This caused confusion because Ivan IV remained the Prince of Moscow, while Grand Knez Simon was appointed Grand Knez of Russia. In addition, Ivan retained the titles of Tsar of all Russia, Tsar of Kazan and Astrakhan, and Lord of Livonia. Ivan was in complete control of relations with foreign states. After the appointment of Grand Knez Simon, Ivan wrote a letter to the new Grand Knez, asking him for his high permission to strip some services from the principalities ruled by Simon and incorporate them into his new udal, or a punich. The distinction between Oprichnina and Zemshina was partially restored, but in a way that did not correspond to the old territorial and administrative division. This led to a ban on the use of the old term Oprichnina, punishable by death, and the term dvor, or palace, came to be preferred. The territory Ivan had set aside for himself stretched as far north as Novgorod and the vicinity of Pskov, and included the area up to the Arctic Ocean. The city of Staritsa, once ruled by his cousin, now became his favorite residence. This preference can probably be attributed to the ruin of the city after the Crimean Tatars burned Moscow to the ground in 1571. Ivan concentrated his forces and energy in this region with the intention of reviving the Livonian War and bringing it to a satisfactory end. Therefore, the place of residence he chose was closer to the center of his future military campaign, which influenced his choice, even though he moved around a lot. For Poland-Lithuania, there was still the problem of finding a king. Although Henri of Anjou had fled, he had not abdicated. Only if he did not return by May 1575 could new elections be held. There was a strong tendency among the Polish Catholic hierarchy, senators, and Lithuanian notables in favor of a Habsburg candidate. The Polish nobles were more inclined towards a Russian candidate, even Ivan, because they felt that Ivan could better protect against Ottoman or Tatar invasions. In Poland-Lithuania, many favored a more Habsburg candidate, fearing that Emperor Maximilian II would have to hand over power to local magnates and would not be able to visit the country as often. The Lithuanian elite, although leaning towards a Russian candidate, preferred Fyodor Ivanovich to his father, as they were more aware of Ivan's character traits than the Poles. Some relied on a tripartite alliance between the Holy Romano-Germanic Empire, Russia, and Poland-Lithuania against the Ottoman Empire. Ivan refused to participate in the debates until he was convinced of his superior merits as a believer, unless he agreed to convert to Catholicism. This led to confusion within the Sejm, and those who supported a Russian candidate were divided between Ivan and his son Fyodor. Ivan was worried about being constantly belittled, and therefore, instead of sending great envoys to Warsaw, he sent an envoy of minor rank in November 1575. This envoy addressed the Sejm and indicated that Ivan was unwilling to change his terms. The Polish-Lithuanian dispute over the throne led some to speculate that Ivan did not really want the crown, or that he was willing to postpone his decision if the Poles and Lithuanians applied to him and accepted his terms. Only Archduke Ernst and Emperor Maximilian remained as serious candidates. Relations between the emperors and the Tsar had cooled somewhat since the Russian invasion of Livonia. The remnants of the Order of Knights in Livonia had previously asked the emperors for help against invaders from Poland-Lithuania, Russia, and Sweden, but no help came. Instead of helping the province, the emperors tried to provide moral support. The throne disputes in Poland presented new diplomatic opportunities for both Russia and the Habsburg Empire, but the sources of intelligence influencing their policies were highly questionable, and the envoys were sometimes unreliable or misleading. The Ottomans, concerned about the emperor's support for Russia, were willing to allow Henri of Valois to travel to Poland via Constantinople. After Henry's escape to France, the Tsar and the emperor acted in concert with the support of Lithuanian notables in Poland. Pauli returned to Vienna in the summer of 1573, while his true status remained a mystery. Ivan began to take measures in response to the proposed alliance against the Ottomans. He provoked the Dnieper River Cossacks to plunder Crimean territory, and the appearance in Russia of Bagdan Alexandrovich, who had been driven out by the Ottomans, strengthened Ivan's hand. The emperor asked Ivan to support the candidacy of his son Ernst for the throne of Poland and to make peace between Livonia and Lithuania. At the same time, however, he demanded the return of Livonia to the empire. This demand led to a deadlock in the negotiations because Ivan was not going to give up Livonia. During the negotiations, the imperial envoys and the Russians not only focused on Poland, but also discussed a possible joint action with the Ottomans and raised the issue of the return of Orthodox Russia to Rome. The imperial envoys stated that they supported Archduke Ernst, not Ivan, for the Polish-Lithuanian throne and insisted against Ivan's claim to Livonia. They promised to negotiate an alliance aimed at expelling the European Turks from Europe. After their defeat at the naval battle of Lepanto in 1571, the Ottomans began to reverse their conquests in Europe. As a result, the diplomatic balance in Eastern Europe began to change. The death of Sultan Selim III in 1574 and his replacement by Murad III signaled a shift in Turkish policy. The emergence of influential figures such as Stefan Báthory, who was among the candidates for the throne of Poland, galvanized the elections. Báthory was elected to the Polish-Lithuanian throne and became the second king of Poland-Lithuania. Ivan was making preparations to attack the Ottoman Empire and support the Crimean Tatars. At the same time, he was making preparations to intervene in the struggle for the throne in Poland. Maximilian sought the help of the Germanic princes to seize the throne of Poland and planned to send envoys to form a formal alliance with Ivan. Ivan continued his attacks against the Swedish forces in Livonia and achieved several victories. However, Danzig's resistance and Maximilian's death complicated his plans. In the end, he allowed Báthory to embark on the Livonian campaign. He also decided to end the reign of Simon Bekbulatovich and gave him the cities of Tver and Torjak as a punishment. Fortunately for Ivan, the death of his old enemy Devlet Giri on June 29, 1577, ended his worries about the southern front. In 1577, the Russians launched a new military campaign centered on Pskov and marched on Livonia. The Swedish king asked for military aid to rearm Sweden and sent delegations to Moscow. However, on July 13, 1577, Ivan, together with the Tatar cavalry under the command of Simeon Bekbulatovich, mobilized and set out to capture southern Livonia. The Russian forces advanced rapidly and achieved a series of victories. Ivan sent letters to Prince Polyabinsky in the Polish-occupied Livonian lands, urging him to surrender. The Russians captured the port of Brno and reached the Dwina River and the outskirts of Riga. However, the emergence of Magnus as a puppet king and the demand to retake the towns occupied by the Russians enraged Ivan. Livonians whom Magnus claimed to be loyal were executed, and the citizens of the towns were sold to Tatar troops. Ivan offered Báthory peace in exchange for surrendering all of Livonia to Russia. Only after Báthory had settled the tensions in Danzig was it possible for him to focus on the war with Russia. Ivan's military campaign was repulsed in 1578 by a joint action of Polish and Swedish forces. The Russians suffered heavy losses, and many brilliant generals were killed or captured. This failure was a serious blow for Ivan and others because it was the result of a joint action of Swedish and Polish-Lithuanian forces. Ivan aroused the anger of some Livonians and Teutons living in Moscow. These people had been exiled from their homes during the old Russian invasion and settled in Moscow. On Ivan's orders, according to one historian, a looting campaign was launched by the Russians and many people lost their lives. In 1578, the Ottomans made peace with Poland-Lithuania in order to focus on the war with Persia, and in September 1579 they brokered a truce between the Crimean Khanate and Poland-Lithuania. In this way, the Ottomans ensured that the Crimean Khan would support them in the Persian War, while at the same time relieving Poland-Lithuania of concerns about its southern border. To the Polish-Lithuanian envoys who arrived in January 1579, Ivan demanded the surrender of Livonia, Kurland, and Polotsk, along with Kiev and many other towns. Ivan wanted these territories on the basis of the Lithuanian princes, the Rogvolodiki dynasty of Polotsk. However, the Russian defeats at Winden in February 1578 prompted the Tsar to continue the war, but to come to a level of relations where mutual emphasis should be placed on peace negotiations. However, the question of relations with Sweden remained unresolved. Johann III continued to hold firmly at Reval and hoped for the capture of Narva. In April 1579, Ivan fell ill and Alexandrovskaya Sloboda gathered the leaders of the church hierarchy and the Boyar Council at his bedside and proclaimed his son Ivan the heir. He also addressed the Boyar Council and asked them to find a way to start peace talks with Báthory. Báthory, on the other hand, continued unstable peace negotiations. However, he now decided to annex Livonia to his kingdom as part of the process of establishing his authority, and possibly even his dynasty, independently of the disputes in Danzig, and formally declared war on Ivan on June 26, 1579. By then, Russia was waging war in Livonia, while Poland-Lithuania had not yet declared war on Russia, despite the Russian capture of Polotsk. It was then that Báthory challenged Ivan to settle their differences in a duel. Báthory's attempt to drive a wedge between the Tsar and the people spurred Ivan to respond. Both sides were preparing for war. Ivan found it difficult to muster his army because many people did not obey the call to arms. Nevertheless, he managed to gather an estimated army of 30 to 40,000 men, and in June he moved towards Pskov to establish his headquarters. Meanwhile, Bathory planned his own military campaign. By shifting troops from Lithuania and Poland and recruiting mercenaries from Germany and Transylvania, he amassed an army of about 40,000 men. Ivan expected Bathory to attack Livonia, not Lithuanian territory, but was surprised by Bathory's sudden appearance in front of Polotsk. The battle was fierce as Polotsk was on the road to Russia and was well defended. However, the besieged city eventually surrendered, and on September 1, 1579, Bathory entered the city. The loss of Polotsk was a deep psychological shock for Ivan. It was a difficult period for Ivan, both militarily and politically, as he struggled with various military difficulties and internal problems. He had to fight both against Poland-Lithuania in the southwest and against the Swedes in the north, in Estonia. It also faced a failed offensive attempt in the Narva region in the north. During this period, while Russia was grappling with various internal and external challenges, Ivan's leadership abilities and strategic decisions were being put to the ultimate test. The 16th century saw various military innovations in Eastern Europe, but these changes were closely linked to geography and climate. Horses still played an important role in battles in the steppes, but both Polish and Russian armed forces increasingly relied on infantry and the use of gunpowder. In addition, ski troops were known both in Sweden and in Russia. In Poland-Lithuania, Bathory introduced a new practice by creating semi-heavy cavalry units. These units were more maneuverable than the heavily armored cavalry of the West. Russian cavalry, on the other hand, was generally light cavalry and better suited to fighting the Tatars. The Russians were superior to the Poles in artillery. Both sides relied heavily on rifle infantry and firepower. On the diplomatic front, trade with England continued through the Arctic Ocean and Narva, but diplomatic relations were strained by Ivan's being on campaign. Ivan hinted that if necessary he could seek asylum from Emperor Maximilian instead of England. Tensions increased when Bathory attacked the Russians again. The Russians took Yelikai Luki from the Poles, but the Poles also defeated the Russian army. In the summer of 1580, Bathory's attack forced Ivan to seriously negotiate peace with Poland-Lithuania. However, neither the Tsar nor Stefan Bathory hesitated to take the first step. In the meantime, Shevardin's meeting with the Pope took place in Rome. The Pope set up a commission to examine Shevardin's letter, which implied that Russia wanted peace, and gave the green light to a possible peace negotiation between Russia and Poland-Lithuania. The Pope appointed Antonio Passavino as ambassador. As a Jesuit priest, Passavino was particularly known for converting Johann III to Catholicism and had experience in interstate relations. The Pope offered Passavino to mediate between Ivan and Stefan Bathory. This would open the door to Ivan's desire for an alliance with the Ottomans, but this alliance had to be within the boundaries of the Catholic Church. Stefan Bathory immediately accepted the Pope's mediation offer. Previously, the papal envoy had already been canvassing for a broad anti-Turkish coalition in Poland. This time the inclusion of Russia did not excite Bathory, as his primary goal was to annex Livonia to his kingdom. However, such rumors encouraged Bathory to continue the war and not to compromise with Ivan. Pope sent Passavino to Vilna because Stefan accepted Bathory's terms. Bathory was confident in Passavino's suitability for the task and wanted to secure the Pope's support in converting Ivan to Catholicism. The parties decided to return to Russia to await a response from Russia. Bathory's new terms included the complete surrender of Livonia and the destruction of Russian border fortresses. Bathory launched his third campaign and started moving towards Pskov. Meanwhile, Ivan took a defensive position as he was facing a Nogai attack. The Polish-Lithuanian attack on Pskov also mobilized King Johann III of Sweden, who, after capturing Narva, headed for Ivangorod and other fortresses. Passavino's offer to return to Bathory's camp and resume negotiations was accepted by Ivan, but there was no reduction in the terms of peace. Ivan had to reconsider the resources as he reduced his excessive spending. In 1580, a meeting of the ecclesiastical council was held, attended by the Tsar and the boyars, and an official decision on church lands was taken. The meeting emphasized the importance of church lands and addressed the neglect of monasteries, and the impoverishment of military servants due to lack of land and labor. The resolution aimed at regulating and limiting the control of church lands. Ivan gave a signature stating that the church was under his direct command. The regulations on church lands were also related to the agricultural crisis in northern and central Russia. The causes of this crisis included the plundering of oprichnina, war losses, low productivity, increased taxes, epidemics, and famine. By the end of 1581, Ivan acknowledged that he had lost Livonia and any hope of gaining a port was gone. Both sides needed peace, but Bathory and Ivan were unwilling to compromise. Pasavino stepped up his efforts to reach peace to build a coalition against the Ottoman Empire, but both sides treated him with distrust. The talks began in Kivarova Gora, 161 kilometers from the Polish camp. Both sides camped and deployed at a certain distance from each other. This was the first high-level diplomatic conference between Russia and a Latin kingdom where diplomatic customs were formally observed. However, the powers given to Ivan's envoys were considered insufficient by the Poles and were rejected. The maneuvering between the two sides continued, but some agreements were reached, with Bathory demanding the whole of Livonia, which Ivan rejected and then accepted. The King of Sweden's request to join the negotiations raised concerns about Ivan's intentions towards Sweden. According to the treaty, a 10-year truce between Russia and Poland-Lithuania was to be declared, and Ivan was to surrender all the captured Livonian territory, Elolotsk and Village, the neighboring fortress on the left bank of the Dvina. Bathory, on the other hand, would return all other fortresses captured by Poland-Lithuania and would not demand compensation. In the Russian text of the treaty, Ivan was given the title of Tsar, but this title was not included in the Polish copy. Other minor issues in dispute were postponed to be dealt with later. There were no provisions on Russia's relations with the papacy or the Ottoman Empire. The treaty marked the end of Ivan's dreams of a Baltic empire and a convenient port. Russia's attempt to hold on to the coast had failed, and Ivan was left standing in the Baltic with only a few fortresses around the Neva. The Russo-Swedish armistice officially confirmed this situation. Pasavino left for Moscow to inform Ivan of these developments. But tragedy struck Ivan. His son, Ivan Ivanovich, had died at Alexandrovskaya Sloboda in November 1581, even at Ivan's hand. This event plunged Ivan into deep grief. The death of his son and the events that followed indicated that Ivan was impatient to accept peace. It is also reported that Ivan's relations with England weakened during this period as he sought asylum in England again. On the British side, there seemed to be a desire to re-establish the trade monopoly. Elizabeth wanted to revive the trade monopoly once held by the Russian company. However, Denmark's claims and its pressure on the Russian company's commercial activities stood in the way of these plans. It is reported that the UK is continuing its efforts regarding the northern route of the UK in order to gain control over the Arctic Ocean and to increase its influence in trade with Russia. Ivan's world was a world that was influenced by religion at every step and fed his thoughts and emotions through religious rituals. Religious rituals played an important role in his daily life, and he attached great importance to pilgrimages throughout his life. At the official papal reception, Pasavino's physical interference with the Russian ambassador, forcing him to kiss the ornate crucifix on the Pope's slipper, could have been offensive to Ivan, who was not accustomed to Russian customs. Russians might have felt humiliated if they were not invited to the Pope's banquet. It was also possible that Ivan felt that the mission to Rome was a waste of time and money. In addition, the demand for free passage through the straits for envoys to Russia had led to England's refusal to allow the passage of representatives of the Catholic monarchies. Ivan agreed to allow the papal delegations to remain within its scope, but opposed the ban on those from other countries. This showed Ivan's sensitivity to religious and political issues. The death of his eldest son in November 1581 shook Ivan's spiritual world to the core. The Tsar seemed to have lost the will to control the administrative machinery and discipline the boyars, and he began to heal some of these wounds. In 1582, he took steps to punish false accusations. He tried to save the souls of some pardoned criminals by sending money to monasteries for sending them to death without even allowing them to confess. Ivan IV was known to have suffered from an illness in the late 1570s and to have health problems in general. Analyses of the mercury and arsenic levels found in his bones have raised the possibility of poisoning, but the very low levels weaken the certainty of this theory. Ivan's illness was thought to be spondylosis, a disease that can cause osteophytes to form in the spine and cause intense pain. Ivan's faith was based on alchemy and magic rather than the scientific rationalism of the Renaissance. He brought sorcerers from the north to prevent conspiracies in his court. In addition, there were several candidates for the throne, which created instability. Ivan's death raised suspicions, and the possibility of foul play was considered. However, no evidence was found, and it seemed to be a natural death, because the divine power that protects kings had protected him from all dangers, and it was unlikely that those around him would commit such an act most of the time. As a result, Ivan's death remained a mystery, and no clear explanation could be given. Ivan's reign is still a complex issue in historical interpretations, and this is an obvious example of the negative effects of ideology on historiography. Ivan's reign is often distorted, but the portrayal by the first professional Russian historian Karamzin should be distinguished from this generalization. Despite having a romantic personality, Karamzin portrayed Ivan as a loving husband and an honest man. However, the events of Ivan's reign have led to different interpretations and evaluations. Ivan's despotism was seen as a necessity in the struggle of the state and the service nobility against the boyars. The ruler was expected to be strong, to consolidate his power, and to use the mother law. In Russian political culture, the monarch was considered to enforce God's will by acting as an intermediary between God and men. However, if he did not fulfill this duty, the people had the right to refuse allegiance to him. During Ivan's reign, there were policies of centralization and military expansion. Ivan achieved significant success by expanding Russia's borders and modernizing its army. However, his economic policies and repressive rule led the country to economic crises and social instability. In foreign policy, Ivan's strengthening of Russia's position in Europe was delayed. Under the influence of the Renaissance and the Reformation, it took time for Russia to be recognized on equal terms with European states and to become more effective in diplomatic relations. However, Ivan's foreign policy was generally far from the traditional European patterns of diplomacy. As a result, Ivan's reign had complex consequences for both domestic and foreign policy. A proper understanding of this period should be based on an objective analysis, free from ideological bias and taking into account various perspectives. Ivan's demands and goals were limited and tended to adapt to the West. Ivan only wanted equal status with the Holy Romano-Germanic Empire, but this demand did not include the domination of other nations. Ivan's despotism, combined with the devastating effects of the war and the demoralization caused by the Oprichnina, prevented Russia from opening up to intellectual and spiritual movements. Russia was slow to react to the intellectual and spiritual movements of Western Europe, characterized by the Renaissance, Reformation, and Counter-Reformation. During this period, Russia developed diplomatic relations with the principalities in the Danube Basin under Ottoman influence, but was unable to open up to the culture and technology of Western Europe due to its focus on the war in the Baltic region and the implementation of Oprichnina. Ivan's final blow to his dynasty was to destroy it by eliminating his cousin Vladimir and one of his children by political murder and accidentally killing his own son, at a time of dynastic prosperity and stability. This resulted in the accession of Fedor, who postponed the dynasty's catastrophe. Ivan combined the corporeal and the divine, giving himself divine power and the authority to act to cleanse the world of sin. Ivan saw himself as a representative of God and believed that his brutality was his divine power. He identified with this idea of sanctity to purify both himself and his people from sin.